Today is June 16th. It's 6:33. This is the work session of the Westchester Borough Planning Commission. We have Alan Berg, Thomas Doherty, Alex Katz. I'm Jim Cherry. Ramsey and Mayor DiBaptista are here as well, along with my wife. So the announcements, I don't have any announcements, citizen comments, none on the agenda, no citizens' comments. Mayor, do you have any comments that are not necessarily listed?
No.
Okay, very good. We have any reports, and we don't have any meetings, minutes to go through, so we're gonna just start with our open issues that are presently on the planning commission. The first one was a review and discussion of the build-to ordinance. I'm going to pull those up onto the screen. Let me see if I can get these out of the way. Okay. So we, let me see if I can get this a little bit wider. Okay. So I was able to obtain from Ramsey the previous zoning summary table that we have just as a reference point, and both are online. The previous version was a very complete, nice table. Here, I'm just gonna get this out to its extents here. But that table, the zoning districts were on the left side of the table, and the criteria was across the top, which was opposite of how the new table went, so it was a little bit tough to compare back and forth. But at least it kind of gave us a reference or a starting point of where the summary was, and this is for area and bulk regulation. Previously, there were, within each zoning district, there were block classes. There was a block class A, B, or C to different groups, which would, I'm going to see if I can point with the arrow, but that would give a separate starting point for each one of the zoning districts. So in the NC1, as an example, in a block class A, the minimum square foot was 20,000 square feet, where in NC1, which is the neighborhood conservation district, in block class C, it was a minimum of 6,500 square feet. So in a block class C, it would allow for a slightly greater density, which was then reflected in some of the other criteria, which was widths at street, front yard requirements, rear yard requirements, that type of stuff. So that somewhere in the new version, we dropped the block classification and became a little, I guess, more consistent relative to, regardless of the size of the properties, what the criteria were for the front yard setbacks or the build-to setbacks. So it's really a build-to line in the front yard. And when I look at this table, I'm just going to go to and get a little bit closer so we can read it. As an example, I just have NC1 and NC2 up on the screen. Then now the build-to line for the front yard is match existing adjacent setbacks, or match existing adjacent setbacks for these guys. So when we go across these pieces, this is what's come into contention or discussion with different applicants coming in for these new developments. And when they're saying match adjacent, there's a tighter definition within our ordinances that talk about the primary face of the primary building. So it's not the edge of the porch, it's not an accessory building, it's the primary facade of the adjacent. But it doesn't really limit or tell you what the extent of that is. It's the intent was within that block or within immediate adjacency. So when we started originally trying to provide some clarification, Tom West had defined maybe a 300-foot left to right kind of approach, or what was a cross the street, and try to find something applicable. What we're really trying to do, especially in the town center, I'll just start there.
What if we can get rid of that thing on the right with that arrow?
You said there was a tighter definition of adjacent setbacks in the code, the previous code?
In the previous version, it was actually provided as a number. So the front yard setback might have been 0, it might have been 25. So I'm just gonna go back to, I don't know what this guy is, but if we could somehow, I'm afraid to,
See what happens.
yeah, it says login, so I'm afraid what would happen. So I'm gonna go to town center, which is the one that's been, because that's where the height overlay districts exist. So within the town center, there used to be 2 block classes. Let's see if I can find my way over to the. I have it right here. It's much easier for me to see here. So in the town center, at block class A, block class B, the front was set at 0. Okay, so it was very simple. You could build to the right of way. Okay. When, so that, we'll see that right here in the table under front, under 0, it's just a 0 number. Right,
And
that's town center.
that's the front of the building, not the steps.
That's the front of the building. So steps, there are allowances for projections into that right of way. And if you look around the borough, we see a lot of stoops,
Right.
a lot of bay windows, a lot of roof overhangs, all of that, all of those elements are past that right of way. Sometimes roof eaves,
Right.
there are pieces.
That came up in the last zoning review letter for Axel Square.
Yeah, I understand that there was another review letter that we didn't get, but it was the second one. So if you could forward that to us, it would be great to understand. I saw that when I was watching Smart Growth, I think
Right.
it was, and they referenced it, and
Yeah, I had gotten that
seen that.
that
Okay,
day.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's something we could distribute, just so we can understand what the new comments were.
Sure.
Because it kind of held it up.
Let me talk to Kristen first, because I know she had some
Okay.
notes on it, so,
Okay, fair enough.
yeah. She was questioning something,
Okay, fair
but it
enough.
brought up that conversation about the street.
Okay, and I think my first line is to go right to definitions. And I think when we go into our ordinances and start looking at definitions, and it starts providing very clear understanding of what the design criteria is. The intent is not necessarily always as clear, but the criteria is clear.
Thank you.
So, so within that town center, which was really where the height overlay districts came in, which is really where the lot consolidations and the opportunities to get a more dense and bigger building mass was happening. That's when some of that criteria happened. With the new ordinance, the ask was match existing adjacent setbacks. So that's using the word setbacks is a tough one. Existing adjacent 5 feet. So when you go again to the definitions, it gets more clear. It's not really the setbacks what's asking for. This is just the table, the summary. When you get into the actual ordinance and read it, they're actually talking about looking at the immediate adjacent primary facades of those buildings and being consistent with those. So it's a contextual approach, which is smart and good. The goal from the planning standpoint is a development that's very consistent with like an urban context. So it's does more than just that building. It's about reinforcing the street and creating a street line and contributing that way. When you're in the borough and you're on Market Street and you drive west, it's from the center of the borough, east. When you drive east and you hit West Goshen, it becomes very apparent. when all of a sudden there's surface parking in front of a building.
Mhm.
All right, it's the opposite of what we're looking to do.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden that urban or that street or that pedestrian kind of friendly environment disappears and it becomes almost a pseudo suburban type of an approach where you have the sidewalk, then surface parking, and then a building setback farther. So this is the opposite where we're looking to have primarily a pedestrian way within the sidewalk and the building, and that's what you're saying. And parking should be in and around the rear or underneath or hidden within space. So it's to minimize the impact visually. But it's really about, and I think Thomas in one of his talks talked about how comfortable people are, pedestrians are walking along walls or walking along buildings as opposed to farther out. So there's something very comfortable about providing that kind of security in that building. But within that, we're kind of at odds with the desire and the intent. And we've realized if when we're asking an applicant to provide that, sometimes what they're really doing is just maxing out the potential development of the property and then just kind of subtracting out the required elements and getting them in there, as opposed to understanding the starting point of that. And even if it's not a wall, creating a colonnade or creating a hedgerow or a wall or something that continues to do that. So we've run into different issues. And so the thought or the goal, and Smart Growth had asked us, was if there's something that we can do to kind of provide a little more clarity both to the applicant as well as borough of what we're really looking
Right.
for. We looked at that, and really within town center, we almost want to be at the right of way. So within the town center area, we do. That being said, we also want to preserve daylight down to street level, space for the street trees. We want to have some flexibility there for entryways. So even if we look at some of the bars along Gay Street or something, they'll tuck doorways back in, or the facades really have undulate a little bit. They're not just a flat, straight plane, which we really don't want a flat, straight plane. We want little places and spaces that are pedestrian scaled. So as you're walking along them, that gives spaces to rest, spaces to gather, spaces to greet people at doorways, whatever it might be. And then in more recent times, in the last decade or so, with the putting tables and chairs out on those sidewalks and starting to kind of mix those pieces, it becomes more understanding that it's actually an outdoor space. It's an outdoor room, and we're really creating a really nice downtown with some good pieces. So we want to make sure everything we're doing continues to reinforce a more urban, small town center. Our biggest word we'll just use relative to the goal is preservation. And I think and preserving that scale that's happened over the last couple hundred years in developing the borough. And rather than when you just buy a whole block and then just flatten it out, that's a whole lot different than a little bit at a time, buildings popping up and then some infill and some stepping back and some stepping forward.
Right.
And it gets a lot more character and whole different scale. It's not one building that's 350 feet long. It was 30 buildings over 100 years. So it creates a little more interest there. But that being said, we have that as a piece to look at, and it really only comes into play when there's a disagreement. I guess it's like any contract, and nobody reads it until there's a problem. And then so the goal was, how can we simplify this build to line and that criteria? One of the thoughts was on town center, maybe it's 0 again. Maybe it's back to what it was because it makes most sense, right? And there's a side yard there that the new requirements were kind of odd, and it actually almost magnified any errors. So if there was a side yard presently, it said match the existing adjacent or 5 feet minimum. So if they were 20 feet over, you had to be 20 feet over, made a 40-foot gap. That's not what we want in the town center.
Right.
We really want the ability to go again, building to building, and to that right of way. So it's really about, of that space. So we don't want a bunch of individual buildings on Gay and Market and those primary streets. We want that wall of, retail stores and activities tied together. So it was just realizing that I'm not sure if someone kept their building off 5 feet, why the new building has to stay off 5 feet. But there are some other requirements from a code standpoint that the applicant would have to deal with anyway, which are fire ratings and requirements. So you can't be within certain feet of other buildings before it becomes a rated wall. So if you're that close, you're at the wall, there's gonna be a built-in, not just called a safety.
Building code takes care of that.
So ours was there something we can do to simplify? So there was a clear understanding. I think town center, in general conversation, we can certainly have comments on it. I think in town center, we felt that 0-0 was actually workable to go back to the previous zoning as opposed to the match the just existing. Now, that takes kind of some of the arguments of it. There's a lot of areas in recent developments that have come up where the proposed development happened in an area that was adjacent to structures that were really very inconsistent with the rest of the town. So you have something that's so far out of being consistent. And I'll use 123, I'll use Market Street as an example. The building just adjacent to it's probably 30 feet back. So that one was there. I'll use 330 Market Street on Eli Khan's. Nudies is set back. All right, so we didn't match that. That was kind of quickly dismissed as that's inconsistent with what we're looking
Right.
for. All right, and when a new development goes in there, which at some point probably will, because it's in a zone that will allow for a significantly bigger, denser, higher building in there. So that can be taken down, rebuilt, and more consistent with the adjacent neighbors. So with that, then they would probably bring the building back up to a street line, but also have to meet the other requirements. So it was about how on some projects, we'll just ignore that building, but on other projects, we're really digging in and getting very finite with that plane, or where is it? Is it the stoop? Is it the porch? Is this an accessory building? Is this the primary dwelling? And so on. So that became an issue or a conversation. All right. And rightly, it's fair enough of a conversation. But you would have to go blocks or have some type of understanding of where that might fit in. So whether you argued one side or the other to it. So I would have argued that more consistent with what we're looking for in the town is to hold the street, to hold the sidewalk. So it would be more consistent that at least a high percentage of the building came up, or a piece of the building came up and touched that sidewalk, so that it was felt related. And really the idea again was to drive, we don't want some of the things that we don't want. There are other pieces of criteria that are asked for: rec space, open space, impervious coverage, things that could allow pocket parks or whatever it might be. So there's things that could generate some desire from the developer standpoint to carve those building areas away, because it would just be to their advantage from a quality standpoint.
And it's required.
And it's required.
Every 32 feet, there has to be
Yeah.
a jut out in the town center.
Mhm.
So I think the requirement is only a very minimal
Yeah,
number
that-
of inches, but right, I would think that would be something to tweak rather than the building, right? If
Yeah,
we're
I
looking for
agree.
that undulation, that's perhaps where that comes in, and also where we can get like some of these, if 90% coverage, then where's that other 10% that could be in this location?
Sure. And I agree with you, because I think it was 8-inch break or something.
No, it's size 6 or something. It's like
It's ridiculously small. I
Yeah.
think a change in, and again, driving some of those things, it could be a change in building materials, it could, but a plane change that's this big is not, it is still a line and still could read in a very strong way visually, but we would encourage more texture. Like the mechanics building is a building that has beautiful bays, and there's like a nice quality about the building, about it. So, but anyway, so the build to became only an issue relative to what does matching the adjacent, especially when the bulk of the developments we've done, the adjacent properties were not consistent with what we were looking for. And then the applicants took full advantage of their interpretation or their version of what should happen, and were not feeling like we were kind of staying on sand as far as what we were pushing back on. So picking and choosing. We'll use, I'll just use what's adjacent to the Rubenstein property, or what's adjacent to 330, what's adjacent to the Burger King property. Every one of those, when you looked at them, they were not the quintessential or the kind of town block or texture that we were looking
If I could
at.
just point out, all those issues are with these very large structures. So I just want to clarify that. Matlack, for example, we had a conversation about what the build-through line was on this in the NC2. And that was a good conversation with the developer. And we pointed out that they didn't need to hold their buildings so far back that the porches could extend into that line. And the build-through line was to the building face. So just to highlight that the real issue and the reason we're looking at this anyway is because of these buildings that are out of scale and proportion. So then maybe that can limit or at least clarify where it's important to address this. Right, if the issue are these large buildings, then maybe it's the zone districts where these buildings are allowed that, we should be clarifying.
Okay, I agree. Now, there are the ID, the IS, the CS, they have the MU, there's specific numbers, 10 feet from the curb, 20 feet from the curb, 75 feet. So they give a fixed number. And that, when they're giving there's a difference between a build to and a setback. When you're doing a building setback, the setback is basically, you can't exceed that. Anywhere from there in, you can build. The build to is, we want them to build to that line, right? So we're looking for them, a portion, that's why I say a portion of that building has to be on that line. And that's where it becomes more difficult, because we can't guess, even if we do 80% of the issues 80% of the time, it's very difficult to anticipate what the impact of the zoning and the zoning changes. So you create a build to line, and you said 100% of the building has to be in the build to line, you would create a very flat block, which is not what we're looking to do. We're trying to be consistent with the more historic texture and how the borough had grown. We're trying to be more consistent and sympathetic to that. So there still needs to be some flexibility in there for our borough council or whatever and to be frank, the applicant to have some flexibility within their design, to understand they're working within the context. They're working within the context of the borough of Westchester. This is not a building that should be stamped out that was used 3 other times very successfully. This is understanding of the quality of the borough. So, and that's what that's why I want to say preservation. It's the whole point about making sure that what we're doing, any growth in here, when we're tearing at a bunch of other buildings that had been contributing or looking at it as contributing resources, removing those, that we're very careful, whatever we're putting in for the next 100 or 200 years, or whatever it might be, is of value. So.
Can I just?
Absolutely.
I just feel like we should point out that the change to the zoning to match the existing came to be because, as carefully drawn as the block class setbacks were, it didn't always work. And I'm just looking at a map now. And the thing about the Burger King was that the new zoning that we said have to match the setback of adjacent buildings, worked for us along Price Street. And I think if we didn't have it, we would have an even larger building on the Burger King site. If it was, I'm not sure of this, I'd have to see a
Jim,
plan.
Do you mind going to the preservation? I actually
Sure.
created a map that might be handy.
Oh,
for
yeah,
this
that-
conversation.
okay,
Because Burger King's in town center. The adjacent buildings along Price are in NC 2. So it does serve us. It did serve us, and I'm still feeling like,
Yeah, that one right there. You go to the fifth page. I created a map for, later conversation that I think could be helpful right now. So what I did is I took a figure ground of the borough, so the buildings are in black, and then I overlaid it onto the zoning districts. And so what you can see is, to exactly your point right there, right, like here's our Burger King site, it's very clear, right, you can even see the consistent setback of everything on High Street that's in the NC2, right? Obviously, as you come up and you get into, our town center, that's the peak area right there. You see other buildings, you can just visually see, okay, what are the buildings doing? What's that consistency?
right.
So if one of these is, not like the others, obviously this one, and then, if we're in the NC2, it makes sense to the NC2, to come in DC. But it's kind of a helpful.
I think visually this is very good to understand because we can see up here along Gay, how
Yep.
much those buildings hold that
Thank
view
God.
line,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
And then, but when we get into areas where it sort of falls apart and whether it's good or bad, this is exactly the kind, along this block right here, which is where they're trying to understand from the Burger King site. There's nothing along this street that holds it until you're 3 or 4 blocks over and then, and west, and then you start picking back up again. And same thing across the street, you look over here along Magnolia, falls apart again. Just south of it starts picking up for a little strip, but at least there's a consistent street front there. But if we were to choose it from planning commission side, we might say, hey, this kind of line right there is what we're looking for on High for residential. If we go north of it, north of town center, it's the same thing. There's some beautiful homes along the top of High Street that are very much more consistent with what we're looking for, And so right in here, again, you're seeing, and what this helps with the black is a density too, is an understanding of space or voids versus building mass, right? And along those streets and how, and when you start making those, what kind of spaces these become, which are actually, when you're in there and you're on Church, you're in that retail space, very nice, very pedestrian types of scaled spaces. They don't feel like you're out in the middle of nowhere. And I'll use that as in, you go down to West Goshen and you look at the developments along farther to the east, you feel like you're in a parking lot with a building off in the distance. So I think the idea of continuing to reinforce that, you can see even on this in the west here, these are very consistent, simple blocks that are consistent with a small town's type of planning that are there. So it's just that sometimes things come apart a little bit. Now, that being said, and it's a hard one, there's that, on Barnard, there's a little apartment building that's kind of like that U shape, and it kind of brings that courtyard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a series of row homes. Those are all single family, but yeah.
Yeah, so it is hard to just say, this is the answer. Mine is, there needs to be like a little stronger criteria to say, this is what we're looking for.
In a
But
lot of ways, that ambiguity is good because
Yeah.
it gives us the flexibility to work with an applicant, and it only falls apart in our experience when we have these buildings that we already don't think are appropriate.
correct, right. And then we're not actually looking to use those as the frame of reference. We're looking to use in the ideal version of what should be there often. So we're seeing past what's there and trying to see what it should be or could be. So anyway, the point about us, I'm gonna just not to take away your presentation later, Thomas, but was to look at these two tables. They're there to show the two differences. And I think if we want to address, we can easily just address town center, I think. which is just go to 0. Go to the right of way, go to the side yards.
I think that's right. I think that this ambiguity has been detrimental to residents and applicants with that, clarity is important. And everywhere else, we worked with Rayot for a while in that zoning update and agreed with him, the planning commission and Rayot agreed that it was a better use to the borough to have the existing build to line. And I think the one place where we've kind of seen that not be as good as that town center area. So, it seems like this is a chance to refine that, but I would hope that we don't try to go back to that block class in the NC areas, at least not without further study, because it was a step in that right direction and Rayot put a lot of work into that. I think it was a good move.
Alex, you have any comments or any?
I keep going back to the point you made about the undulation of the buildings. So I feel like it's a really complex problem where you have these big block buildings coming up and stretching, and to your point, the 300 feet of consistent facade in front. How do you actually address that? My wheels are spinning in terms.
Well, I mean, we have legislation in our zoning, it has to step, and perhaps it's
Yeah, but
giving a
what you were
realistic.
talking about was like a.
Exactly, so
With a gutter.
that's right. And so, what if we were to actually change that dimension, right? That legislation is already in place, and so maybe that's,
I think there needs to be more focus on that
yeah.
topic, because I think that's really
Yeah.
what's the detriment to preserving of the character.
Yeah, and I would like to, because of the height overlays and I like the 0 on the right of way, but there should be something relative to preserving the quality at street level for pedestrians. So I think to have an allowance for street trees to exist. So either a relief at the street trees or stepping back of the building or something in conjunction that says, yeah, you can build a bigger footprint, but you need to provide some. And I didn't want to do it as prescribed as like the hotel where step it back 10, after 3 stories, step it back 10 feet. I think you do that and like 100 years from now, all the buildings go up 3 stories and step back 10 feet. And that would also look a little bit funny. I think we're better with just the idea that I still want the flexibility from the design team for the applicants to approach the project in context with their specific needs, requirements, use, location, and then themselves take on the opportunity to relieve it at the trees or relieve something at the street entrance or provide those public spaces, which are requirements, but that's why they should be adjacent to the sidewalks and adjacent to the building. So I think this.
I wonder if we could just settle on 0 in town center, but encourage perhaps under the direction of maybe a Tom Cometa, some new design standards that could address some of these so that we're not.
Well,
It doesn't necessarily have to be built into, if it's part of the design standards, it's still a requirement,
Yeah.
but, and it could allow for. I don't know if this, if it might allow for a little undulation, a little of these interest points, street trees and all of that, and how you deal with that, ways in which that can be dealt with,
Sure.
and still, I just,
Yeah, maybe there is something that we can come up with or
Yeah.
Tom or somebody that,
because Tom wrote
Thomas.
most of the design
Yeah,
standards.
right. But even with, these are,
And he is fanatical about what you're talking about too. Adding interest and, some.
yeah, and I think I agree with not prescribing something because then everything matches it. I think
Yeah.
the idea of having that flexibility, I think 0, 0 is easy too, but I think the idea of almost like where the appendixes and on our designs show both the criteria as well as the intent.
Yeah.
I think the intent portion of it, which is what we're trying to do is to be very consistent with the context. Without necessarily having to, you're not repeating, we're not saying that that's the answer, but So do you think we just want to take this just as town center for now?
I definitely do, yep.
I think the only other one is NC2. NC2 and NC3 also have the matching the existing adjacents. I think they're met more successfully because they're probably
Yes.
individual homes and it makes a lot more sense relative to what it is. It's really just the town center we're having a beef with, and it's primarily because of the larger buildings.
So
So,
that's correct, yeah.
So may I ask two questions?
absolutely.
So did I hear you say that there is now things in the pipeline to reduce the size of the buildings or somehow counteract these huge box buildings being built?
There should be, I mean, there are levers. We should be doing more to push back on this.
Well, we have actually been guided to, that we're not, you can't do that. You're not allowed,
Yeah.
the solicitor pretty much.
The solicitor said we
Yeah,
can't,
you can't do
we
that.
can't stop them.
So we're looking for
Consolidate.
ways to bring about a better outcome with big buildings, realizing that that isn't necessarily an option.
But to Alex's point, could we not have as part of this build to, if we're gonna be making an argument with the build to line, that in both, I think the saldo and the zoning, it's both cited, the break of the building after, it says something like, the building can't extend in a plane more than 35 feet.
Sure.
And if it is going to be longer than 35 feet, every 32 feet, there has to be a step. Perhaps it's worth tying that dimension and saying, hey, it needs to go from 6 inches to another dimension. Would that be worth tying those two together, or are those?
Well, that's where it's
Separate.
prescribed. Well, I don't know that we should tie it together. I do think the one part of it's real easy because it's just allows everybody to go out to a more appropriate location and doesn't
And
require
clarity.
and clarity,
That's-
which was really the biggie.
So could we just go back, because I want to get caught up to what this solicitor stated. So they said that there's certain.
The solicitor's comments were specific to, is there anything that could be done about developers coming in and purchasing a whole bunch of adjacent properties and consolidating them into one large one?
Oh, yes, but I mean, the other municipalities across the country, I mean, they might have said that, but I can point to other municipalities that have maximum lot sizes and maximum building sizes.
Oh, sure.
Right.
But I'm saying that they were not, I think the solicitor advises we were not allowed to dictate. There was something there that I'd have to go back.
We have minimum lot sizes
We have
and so
minimum.
like
Well,
the
that-
city of Charleston, even I think Annapolis is now
Yeah.
passing things.
And it's
that-
actually what we're trying to do the other way, which is have an overlay district for reducing the sizes of everything. So allowing a building that's more consistent with the type of developments that's happened over the past, which is now presently not allowed. So presently, the minimum lot width is 20 feet. Previously, there were people building 14-foot, 16-foot wide townhomes in there. So we wanted to put an overlay district to allow everything that was nice and what everybody likes back into being legal, back into the code without having to require variances or waivers, but just saying, hey, I'm going to take an advantage by meeting these steps and provide this, which may be something of, hey, more durable building products like brick or something more consistent or sympathetic to the scale. So it's about promoting a more sympathetic or consistent building type to older historic buildings.
But it doesn't directly say anything about these large structures.
Right.
But we could, if the city wanted to, the city could absolutely. take
Size
steps.
of, how they
Well, right now,
How
the
they-
lit,
buy all these properties up, like directly across the street,
sure,
where that proposed project
Sure.
is going in on a partial floodplain, which I'm not really sure how you permitted it, but okay. That's another question for another time. But that's gonna probably be the hugest block building in the borough.
yeah. To
Say
be,
that 3 times.
so this,
Block building in the borough, but it's going to, and it's going.
You talking about the Rubensteins?
no,
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 You're
no,
talking about the one across the street?
yeah,
I'm talking
but,
about
yeah, but
from which
Adams.
Dodge Street
Yeah.
to where the Taco Bell is?
Yeah.
That's 3/4 of the block.
Yeah, but to be fair, that hasn't been in front of us yet. So that's the zoning here. It was,
It
it was in
was.
front of zoning.
I thought it was one time.
We haven't seen it yet.
We haven't seen it yet.
Oh, good, because I want to be at
So-
every meeting.
Okay. So I mean,
Want you
but-
at every meeting.
but I mean, and again, everything has kind of, to try to have an understanding. You go back to the comprehensive plan, you go back to decades ago and you try to understand, well, how did this happen or why did this happen? And I think some of it was a reaction when the county left or when the county left the borough and there were some vacancies. All right, some vacant storefronts, some vacant office buildings, a concern about, how are we gonna attract people's back in here? What are we gonna do to incentivize this? And that's where the home owner occupancy, that's where the heights, and these are where these things came from, that are in the comprehensive plan, which is about 2016, I think it was the date of that. So you look at that and you can 100% understand. It's a fine line boroughs walk between a vibrant, growing borough, which that's what we want. You know, I think, I know there's some, not my backyards, we don't want development here, but you really don't want that. You don't want that. If you go to a dying town or you go to a borough that's got some large vacancies and the values are dropping, they're like, yeah, I got my affordable house now. Yeah, because nobody wants to be there. So what we have is we're trying to like kind of manage growth in a very positive, good way that's encouraging people to be here. We're in demand. People want to be here. That's the situation you want. And
Right,
we're very fortunate, some of the other entities here, the university, the county back in here, these are positive things, not negative things.
Well-
These are things that bring youth and money and then they're
Absolutely.
good.
I would agree. What I am not agreeing with is the idea of taking these smaller lots, making them into one huge lot, so there can be one huge building. There was a time when building in Westchester was primarily built for single homeowners. I mean, I look at the beautiful and buildings on West Market Street, the brick townhouses there. I don't know if what 100 block that is, but right after you cross Wayne to your left. Before Wayne, but they're beautiful, 3 or 4 beautiful brick row homes.
So,
So, I mean, there was a time when we were building homes and now it seems like we're not, like there's no incentive to build homes.
It's illegal to build.
It's illegal to build.
We've had
Right,
a lot of minimum lot sizes, and just like, we have a standard that says, hey, lots can't be smaller than this, and perhaps I'm gonna argue that it's inappropriately scaled. There is precedent across the country to say, hey, lots can be too big too, and we can have maximum lot size.
Yeah.
That is kind of
I think you'll like the presentation later because that's what it's about.
and the one on Washington Street, I'm glad that's not going to be a little apartment building fit in there.
No, we were very happy with that.
that was also rejected by the solicitor. I mean, after we went through this, we had the solicitor come in. He said, here are our thoughts about ways in which we can keep this from recurring. Not allowing people to subdivide or to reverse subdivide and build big buildings.
Right,
Can't do it. Maximum building size, can't do it. I mean, we went through this. I agree with you completely, but
Yeah.
the guidance we're getting says
Yeah.
you have to
We
find
get-
another solution to it.
We have it now. So lot consolidation, I will ask again if that can get to Tom or Kristen. And just if they could provide some clarification again of why that was an issue. But I know that was a solicitor comment that said, no, you can't.
right. Well, they were, that the same solicitor when talking about Airbnbs, when that was a year-long conversation with council, was saying, no, you can't do this. And we showed where, yes, like to your point, it was done in other parts of the country, and this is what was done. And then the tune changed. So, I think, sometimes their worldview needs to be broadened sometimes.
Sure.
But I do like the idea of homes, because right now we're gonna really be out of proportion with all these,
That's right. We have more units planned and
right,
a lot of them already permitted in Westchester.
right,
And I think all of Chester County for the last 3 years combined.
right, right.
The units.
And we're really gonna be, right now, we're at what, 55, 45, something like that. We're gonna be, it's gonna be primarily apartments with these huge apartments potentially coming up.
Yep.
And so it's kind of discouraging.
Yeah.
On the other hand, what I dislike is they build within every inch of the property and then turn around and say, oh, well, we don't have room for all the trees you require. So we'll just pay the in lieu of fee, because we don't want to put, so that the landscape is sparse and it's the bare minimum.
Sure.
And then if we're getting to the in lieu of fee, I'd like to talk about how that has not been raised since it was initiated, and it needs to be, so. Anyway.
Okay, well, I'm gonna say from relative to the discussion on the bill two, we'll look at, I don't know if we have to have something drafted by Tom, SD, or just request it. We can make a motion next week, to, request that, or maybe we can even word it as specific, but we're not, I don't know, do we request it from Tom or do we?
From Tom, I'm sorry, repeat what you want to request
Okay.
from him?
I think we're
Bill-
generally, at least verbally, not taking a vote or anything, in agreement that the town center should go 0 side yard, 0 front yard.
Okay,
Okay, and we'd like that changed
okay.
in the ordinance. Is that something we have to make a motion and vote on next week?
I would make a I think it should go to smart growth and the council before you draft an ordinance, because if council
Sure.
disagrees, then you're
Sure.
paying money for nothing.
Sure. Okay,
So we could do it that way if you want to discuss it there. Are you gonna incrementally change the ordinance? Is that the plan?
well, the town center is really the biggest impact, 'cause
Okay.
that's where we're allowing the height overlay district.
Yeah,
So it covers almost entirely the problem.
okay.
Without accidentally negatively impacting some of the, the neighborhood conservation districts.
I would suggest if between now and the next, well, what's the next meeting? Yes, now and the next meeting, if you guys have any other feedback on things that you'd like to change, then we could take it all to smart growth, just so you, if there is anything else.
Sure,
There
we
might
can-
not be, I
Well, there is.
understand that, but then that way we're not having a hearing and a hearing and a hearing,
Okay, so I'll write a letter and see if I can't get on smart growth. A smart growth meeting and talk to them.
yeah, I can do that. You don't have, you don't have to write a letter. I think as a group though, if you all decide at the voting session that that's the move, maybe you have other thoughts at the voting session that you want to discuss.
The only thing I would say is, we've been dealing with this build to line, looking for a solution. I'm gonna guess 1.5 years. We've been talking about this now. We probably have 10, 12 hours of discussion. So it's, I think, speaking for myself, I'd love to see it not delayed any further. We have not been as forceful about it and as clear about it. But we've had a number of different players in it and different ideas and all that. So it's something that I just hope it doesn't happen
It's-
next year or something like that.
No, I don't expect that at all, but I think after Tom's presentation, if there's other changes, I
Yeah.
think council would
Okay.
probably like to see as much together at once as possible. But I understand where you're coming from too, so I don't, if you guys meet and say, well, this is all we really want for now, we want more time to discuss the rest, then I think that's easy.
Sure.
I just am hesitant to because I'm never gonna stop anyone from changing
Sure.
anything, but we did just do the hard ordinance, and so I could at least time it with another hearing.
Sure.
I do think there's something to be said about finding some quick wins on things that or that you guys have been working on for some time.
I'm sorry, sir?
Finding some quick wins and getting them over the finish line.
Yeah.
And then maybe a phase 2 to come back.
Well,
With
we
a more-
already have some quick wins.
Right, that's what I'm suggesting, to not delay that any further.
Yeah,
And then we're also up against the clock because how many new developments are gonna come in front of us? And as soon as they're in front of us, then it's already started and we take.
You're like-
We have to get in front of, the next part of our project.
Please.
So, all right, so I agree with you, Ramsey. We'll see what we can do in the next couple items, whether we can, kind of group these together, because I think it would make sense for everybody
Yeah,
from a process standpoint.
But either way, I'll.
Sure.
I'll put it on.
Sure. So next, so that was, I think that's good for the build to, and understanding. The rec space or fee in lieu, I'm just going to give a little background again, because Alan wanted to bring this subject up as well. And we had run into an impasse on this one as well, that we had tried to draft the discussion really took place relative to the fact that the MPC provides the teeth for municipalities to ask for rec space or, which is what I just handed everybody. So I have to get it loaded up onto the website, but it's basically one section that the state throws onto different municipalities that says this is where you're allowed to, or why, or what authority do you have just to ask for a piece of land from a landowner. All right, so that I highlighted in two sections because the darker ones are more important. But anyway, when we had gone through discussions, there were discussions relative to courtyards. There was discussions relative to the quality of space. As an example of what was brought up with next to the Hotel Warner, a recreation space, like 5 feet by the length of the property, was offered as the recreation space. It's really just 6 feet worth of weeds and completely useless space. It's not rec space at all. It's closer to a buffer. But anyway, if you're looking at it like, what's that? And thanks for nothing. It's just a eyesore and a maintenance problem that's not being addressed. So when we're looking at this, it's hard to say, well, what's the borough actually looking for? And often when space is made available to the borough for recreation space, the borough then has the opportunity that it becomes part of the borough's recreation space, or it's continued to stay under the ownership and care of the development or the developer, right? In most cases, when that has happened, if it's happened, it's more desirable that the landowner or the developer keeps the property and maintains the property, because of the borough really doesn't want a bunch of 100-square-foot little properties all around the borough and have to be responsible for maintaining them. Or if somebody's there, say for instance, somebody's hurt on one of these pieces of land or whatever might happen. There's lots of layers of what are we actually asking for and what are we actually doing with this space. So often the borough is not really actually even interested in the land as much as they're interested in providing that requirement. And if the developer decides, hey, I don't have that space to give, there, an allowable option is they pay a fee in lieu of providing that recreation space, right? So there is a formula that's been developed based on, and again, based on the state's municipal planning code that says we're allowed to establish what that is, and those developers know what it is, and sometimes it's more viable for them just to pay a fee rather than that. So, all right, so that's what that piece was. And then,
can I just speak to
Okay.
the item listed here is not the concept of fee in lieu.
well, I'm just gonna give it back, I'm just gonna give a background what,
I know, okay.
what happened to
I
it.
appreciate that. And this is on here at my request, but, in the,
So let me finish up,
Subdivision.
let me just finish up
Go
one
ahead.
sentence, because I was like one sentence away from finishing. So what we said was, if the borough is really just looking for a fee, why don't we just ask for a fee? If that's really at the end of the day what the borough is looking for, and we don't really want the little properties, and we're going to take a fee instead. So we had offered that, Kristen said that was illegal. Just can't ask for the fee. So that put that to an end real quick. We said, let's get into a discussion relative to what constitutes recreation space. Because in fact, we should be able to define what kind of quality, what kind of proportion, what kind of activities, who that's for. That's when I dug into it, it got a little bit dicier. That leads to
Okay.
the part where Alan talked about, which is in our design guidelines, which is what's referenced on our schedule, 97A19.19. It shows a picture of a courtyard. The courtyard is elevated, it's Chestnut Square. And it shows that in the definition of rec space, which became a point of conversation
Right.
relative to whether that the developers are saying, hey, these elevated courtyards, they count,
Right.
right? So mine is, again, not prejudging, not trying to understand where it comes from, what the requirement. And that's why I brought this today, right?
Okay.
Because this is the basis of the discussion, because other than that, it's not a matter of what I feel, it's a matter of what's legal and what we have the authority to say. And so it breaks it down. There's one general piece here. Provisions requiring the public dedication of land suitable for use intended and upon agreement with the applicant or developer, the construction of recreational facilities, the payment of fees in lieu thereof, the private reservation of the land or a combination for park or recreation purposes as a condition precedent to final plan approval, provided that. So then it gives the provisions. So it's basically saying you can ask for this, that gives the municipalities. It doesn't define anything beyond that. Now, within this one, where I highlighted extra large was it said dedication of land. It said the construction of recreational facilities, so defining that as something for park or recreation purposes. So it's a pretty broad what's recreation space. Now, as you read down through items 1 through 8, it becomes some conflicts here, which is where my concern was, right? And I'm going to go to 2. The ordinance includes definite standards for determining the proportion of a development to be dedicated and the amount of any fee to be paid in lieu of thereof. So our ordinance gives a percentage, 10% or whatever the percentage is, I believe it's 10%. And it also gives the fee to be paid in lieu of, which is a formula based on how many units or how many pieces on there. The next statement was the one that is the pivot for our conversation here. The land or fees or combination thereof are to be used only for the purpose of providing, acquiring, operating, or maintaining park or recreational facilities reasonably accessible to the development. So accessible to development. It's not accessible to the public. It's accessible to development. That's something just to hold that thought as a moment. When you go down to 5, the amount and location of land to be dedicated or the fees to be paid shall bear a reasonable relationship to the use of the park and recreational facilities by future inhabitants of the development or subdivision. It's not talking about the public or anybody outside. So provision 5 says facilities by future inhabitants of the development or the subdivision. That's a tough one to say. Now, and this is where I was saying, when you go into open space, rec space, public space, and you look at different housing types, the only one that the borough seemed to be pushing was apartments open to the public. But clusters, like where Tom West lived, that's only for the residents that happen in there. For condominiums, only for the residents that happen here. And my thing is, I'm not sure we should discriminate relative to a buyer or a renter. The fact is, if they're renting, in my opinion, they're due the same level of privacy, security, and place and that everybody else is. So that's where it becomes more difficult. So mine is, because they're renting this space doesn't mean that they should be able to have to share their pool or with the rest of the borough. That's where it becomes tough. So mine is, I understand, but, so I think it's a solicitor's question, because sentence 1 says, provisions requiring the public dedication of land. So when they're asking for land, that's a parcel of ground. That's a chunk of the ground, right? So that's different than an elevated courtyard. So our problem was asking for the recreation space that the intent may have been for the ground. And then the developers maxed out the ground with the building and provided a courtyard and said, that's our rec space. And then the argument was, is it? Right? And mine is per municipal planning code, I think you can make a point that, in fact, it is. What would that argument be? Well, it does take load off of public amenities or public parks by providing another one. At the same time, we don't want people to abandon the streets or the neighborhoods or the parks. We're trying to, there's the community aspect of it. Now, that's where this thing I said is, it says for inhabitants of the development. So it's a tough one. I feel like this conflicts with itself, and it takes somebody like an attorney to tell me otherwise. But I believe the borough has the right to ask for rec space, but whether or not the courtyard counts as that or not is what our discussion has to be on, because because some of the developments, I'll use Rubenstein, I'll use Chestnut Square, they've built elevated pieces that are not accessible, they're not land. So do they still owe a fee? They're not accessible to public, right? But they are usable and accessible to the development. So I think somewhere in there, the attorney needs, the solicitor needs to say, this is what this is allowing. And is that,
So they're not providing public space. Those elevated courtyards are not
well,
providing,
they're not accessible to the general public.
they are not, and they're
Right.
not providing public space or
Right.
recreation space.
Right,
So that in lieu of fee would still be required.
correct. Well, that's
And
what, that's,
that one picture of Chestnut Square unfortunately set the tone in that publication of the elevated square,
sure.
set the tone for what they thought should be happening in all subsequent developments. But I think that has kind of come to a halt, I hope, with all the new proposed developments. I mean, that was a big extended conversation, say with the Rubenstein's development over here, the potential development of that. Because not only did they have a little strip of ground, then they had a little strip of ground across the street and wanted to say all of that should be included. And we're like, no, first of all, it's not adjacent. I think somewhere along it's supposed to be adjacent. Across the street isn't adjacent. But be that, and then they wanted to include some ground like three doors down.
Yeah, that one was too remote. I think the one immediately,
was-
I think the one that
The one
was
across
adjacent to the
street
sidewalk, we
wasn't
were
included.
okay with.
Right.
We thought we wanted the dollar credit for the other piece.
But they were still trying to not pay the in lieu of fee.
Sure, that's where
However,
solicitors are,
right,
yeah.
right. So
Yeah.
my point is, those elevated courtyards are not public space and should not be considered.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I'm saying is I think the solicitor needs to look at this because it doesn't, if you look at line item number 5, it's asking for it to be for the use of the residents of that development. So it's for inhabitants of the development. So if you go to item number 2, it says proportion of a development to be a dedicated amount of fee. If you look at number 3, maintain park recreation facilities reasonably accessible to the development. It doesn't say reasonably accessible to the public. So that's what, all I'm saying is, this is the law that allows the borough to take this is behind what the borough is asking for. So in line item number 3, it's saying you need to provide reasonable, basically rec space accessible to the development. That's the part where I go, I'm not sure that, that should not be discussed because land in the borough is the value. That's the commodity, right? And the developers would in fact rather just pay a fee than give up the land. The development rights on 75 feet high or 60 feet high is way more valuable than the piece of land being, they will pay the one-time fee. So what I'm saying is, I'm not sure. And there are other asks, open space, impervious coverage, public space. They're not rec space, but you're allowed to have those other provisions. So I'm just saying is the one that's in for recreation space, that's specific to recreation. Does that meet it or not? Who's it for? Who's it for from from the
Maybe
state?
this has to be tightened up better.
Well, this is the state. This is not
This is
us.
saying it's requiring the public dedication of land and that it should be accessible by the development, right?
By the
That's-
development.
But that doesn't mean solely by the development. It's still dedication of public land.
Well,
It needs to be.
well,
like
that's
the
what I'm
mayor
saying.
said, like,
We'd have-
adjacent counts.
Well, that's what I'm saying is, it says on 5, inhabitants of the development.
Right, but
doesn't
it,
say-
it says the amount and location of the land to be dedicated or the fees to be paid shall bear a reasonable relationship to the use of the park and recreational facilities by future inhabitants of the development or subdivision. It doesn't say solely, it just means that.
Well,
you
that's
have access
what
to
I'm
it.
saying. That's what I'm saying. I feel like the solicitor has to weigh in
I was
on
about to say, we've talked about this at
that.
nauseam.
We've talked about it and talked about it, yeah.
It's above our pay grade. Everybody knows what our preference is.
Yeah,
And then this is a borough council solicitor
yeah.
thing.
Has Tom not?
Why would it continue?
Well, Tom is
No.
the one that helped
Yeah.
to define this.
No, this is the state. This is not ours. This is the state. This is
Oh, the
Pennsylvania State.
Oh, yeah, yeah, well.
This is the
helped
PA
define-
municipal planning code. So that based on this, which is like a binder that thick, that's, so the municipality planning code, they only establish a certain amount. And then they sent it out to the over 2,500 municipalities in
Right.
Pennsylvania and said, all of you guys use this as your basis, as your structure to come up with your local
And
laws.
that's the one we
ordinance.
helped to come up with.
That's right. He has that. Now, I'm not sure. So,
And there is a slight difference.
well, yeah, because this is just giving you the teeth.
Right, right.
You just can't, we just can't at whim say, we'll take your land. All right, it's a little
Right.
tougher than that. What we're saying is this gives the borough the authority to ask for that record space
So
or
I
a
guess
fee.
I'm confused to what
The
your
attorney,
question is.
now, when I went to borough council,
Uh-huh,
Kristen said, what we're asking for is illegal and shut it down, all right?
to shut down the annuity?
No, the way we had previously asked, which was just, and we just asked for a
Oh,
fee.
right,
so
right.
That it was not legal. So
Right.
what I'm saying is, so we went back to see if there was another direction to come at this relative to, and it was, a lot of it was around the courtyards. Because the developers were like, hey, we gave you, Brian Nagel would argue that this is recreation space. And in fact, it is recreation space. It's just a matter of whether or not that satisfies what the borough is asking for recreation space. And that has to be bounced off of this, which is what gives the authority for the borough to ask for it to begin with.
Right.
And that's why I said in line 1, it says public dedication of land suitable. And that's why I think we have the teeth to ask for the land. However, if you read all the criteria, it says provided that, and then as it
Right.
says provided, and that's where it gets into legalese. So I was saying is, I don't disagree with what we were trying to do, what's consistent, but I think we need to do it from a legal standpoint, and that needs to be Tom.
Have you asked this before of him? Like, he hasn't ever weighed in on this?
Kristen was the one who was
And-
present for those
And what did she
discussions.
say?
She said what we were asking for was illegal.
But you were saying you wanted to just ask for a fee, right?
Right.
Right.
And that's part of the
Different.
thing.
And Tom and Aaron had rewritten a whole bunch of the provisions. So it wasn't just a one line. It wasn't like, hey, we just want to ask for this. We said, hey, these are all the different edits we'd like to make to this. And we gave the whole package over and that was shot down. So it wasn't like there wasn't an effort put there. It was just, it was not well received. I just
By
put that
Tom or by Kristen?
by Kristen.
Okay, so,
So mine is, if we want to get back down to a very simple, so what Alan is saying is,
Can I speak for myself? I mean,
Yeah.
I wanted to hear everything you had to say. I get a clear impression you're really dug in here and that you don't really have a lot of space for opposing opinions, but I watched the development of this and In the copy that I have of this, the swimming pool does not appear. 19A, 1919 does not appear. It was added later on. I don't know how or in what, through what body, but it came in through the back door. Okay, so I believe that it's worthwhile to pursue this because it clearly states this is public space. And public is not a
Are
word.
you
that
saying public or rec space? They're two different
It's
things.
public space.
But that's different than recreation space. Our definitions have an open space, a public space, a rec space.
Well, under recreational facilities, it talks about public space.
Okay,
Oh, sorry, what?
I'll go back.
Either
I'll-
way,
It's defining this inaccessible swimming pool as public space. That, to me, does not make any sense, regardless how the state has posted this and provided direction. I think.
Did you do, are you looking at 97A 1919?
Yes.
You're looking at a different, okay.
Yeah. So I don't believe that we should walk around saying, yes, this closed swimming pool is public space.
It definitely should not count, and they should be required to provide a fee and lieu.
Public space.
I think that
I'm gonna-
well, I'm gonna find out, because I think that the concern from Kristen wasn't about
No, it wasn't.
this here, it was about assigning a fee
Yes.
that you've pulled out of thin air.
Exactly.
This is requiring dedication of public space or a fee in lieu of. It has, and it has to be just
Okay,
accessible.
I'm just gonna say it again. It's not public space, it's recreation space.
No, it
It's-
is public.
Okay, I'm just saying is our own ordinance defines those differently. And that's why I say it's a little more nuanced. You just can't throw around open space, public space, recreation space. Recreation space, there's a definition for recreation space. Public space, there's a definition for public space. They're different spaces and they're both required. So you have a requirement for public space. You have a requirement for rec space or fee in lieu. All right, that's the difference. It's not one or the other. You're required to have both of them. All right, just like you're required heights, areas, build twos, whatever. This is part of our ordinance. So what I'm saying is, the same thing Thomas is saying is, when we got to this argument, and we talked to it before, it got down to, this is above our pay grade. This is a solicitor and a borough council decision on what they're actually asking the applicant for, what they're looking for. Ours was, if you want the fee, ask for the fee. They said no. We're like, fine. All right, so then it comes down to nuanced pieces in here, which I say is, these arguments are made by the applicants and ourselves, whether or not the courtyard does or doesn't count as rec space. I'm saying is, that's not our argument.
And
Right.
I just want to appreciate, because I know you were doing a lot of legwork
Mhm.
6 months ago. You were going to extra meetings, you were meeting up with the solicitor, you were meeting up with Tom Committa
Mhm.
and Tom Committa's team.
Mhm.
I know you were putting a ton of hours into this, and it was when you got to that point where you had uncovered all these different definitions, you had gone to, here's the state, here are all these other things, that the solicitor was saying, hey, we're hitting a wall here. So I do think this is that's a door that Borough Council should be knocking on,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
That's up to Borough Council to be saying, hey, solicitor, we want you to relook at this because we need more clarity. But you've done so much digging, which I hugely appreciate.
Mhm.
And any word banning, we're talking about definitions, but
Yeah, so
there's
my,
been hours of you guys.
so my thing is, if you're saying you don't want courtyards to count, I can 100% respect that. And I'm not having a problem with.
None of us want prayers, Cam.
What I'm saying is the attorney or the solicitor has to say, can we say that or not? That's all. Or Borough Council has to say, that's not acceptable for us, or whatever. But somebody may say, make a decision at a legal level, because when you read the MPC, it conflicts with itself, which is what I'm saying. Line 1 says land, line 5 says for inhabitants.
I do think it's important to communicate to the solicitor the wishes of the governing body. Is it possible to legally,
Correct.
and I think the solicitor will look at this and she's in a defensive posture because this got done on her watch, so she's immediately going to find ways to make it look good, to make it make sense, when it does not.
Can we like
So-
sum this up in a letter to
Her
council
job
asking them
is
not
to
amend?
execute the wishes of the government,
Yes.
the
Thank
municipality.
you.
It's not to take a defensive posture just because
Yeah,
a
I don't
big
think.
blunder was
yeah.
made here.
And just in defense of Kristen, I don't think she was taking a defense approach. I think they're trying to understand and say, this is what we have legal standing on. Or not.
So,
So-
May
so
I
my-
just,
yeah.
I just have to say this.
Sure.
I think the whole approach to just going after the money was fundamentally not the right direction to
Okay.
take. I'm sorry. I know that you own this very complicated issue. You, as Tom said, you did a lot of work on it, and I appreciate that. I think that got us spiraling in a very challenging direction. I'm not interested. Fee in lieu is statewide. It makes sense. I understand the purpose of it. I am only arguing with this picture and 97A, 1919.
Sure.
That's it.
Sure. Sure.
Okay, and this was even looked at by our borough planner, who said, take the picture out, change one word in here, and we're there.
right,
Sure.
right.
Yeah, so, but most of all, I think what's absolutely critical here, that we make our wishes known to the solicitor
Sure.
Right.
and not have her, who has,
More broadly, we make our wishes known to the borough council, right?
Right.
And then borough
Yeah,
council.
that's correct.
And exactly, because everything you just said is true. She does work for the government and for the planning commission and for the borough, it's not her will, it's what our will is.
yes,
And.
find a way to execute what
And,
we want.
and it was, I understand, from reading past documents, this whole thing did not come about easily. So we certainly don't want any backdoors for anyone to avoid it. And I don't think it was the borough's posture to go after just the money. It's the developer's posture not to give up a square inch of concrete for green space.
Sure.
And so you have no choice but to try to figure out, okay, what's the next best steps? And then
Right, so I think,
go after the money.
all
Because
we're
they're
saying
not
is-
interested in green space, they're interested in the Bill 2 line and all of that. That's.
well, we are entitled to ask for the rec space, and then the
Right.
borough has to decide whether or not they do or don't accept courtyards as rec space, or whether they're saying what we're asking for is ground level square footage or a fee.
Why?
Somebody needs to clarify that.
I
So
think after the last two responses to builders trying to have elevated courtyards as I don't want to use the wrong term since there's many definitions, but as rec space, I think I'm using the right one.
That's cool.
I think the borough's position is no, that is not acceptable. So you do have to pay the fee in lieu.
Sure.
So,
And then-
but to your point, come up with what you think is good for the borough and let the council know that because they have a great deal of respect for all of you. And, and I for one like to see it when you come to the meetings because you have impact and it makes a difference.
Mhm. Okay, well, I think, Ramsey, if I'm understanding, we can get Tom, we can write a letter to Tom and have him look at this?
Yeah, I'm actually writing an email right now.
Okay.
Um,
And because I think that's where it belongs. And then I think I'm gonna tell you that the borough council needs to review what he comes up with to
Correct.
clarify their point, their goals.
Because we don't want any murky areas because.
Right, well, it leaves us even worse because A, we're an advisory committee and B, we're thinking that we're asking for spaces that make perfectly good sense. But we're ending up with, you can look at that bad sides and see what's going wrong and say, I don't want a 50-foot, I don't want a 5-foot by 100-foot stretch of land along an alley. That's not recreation space. What we're asking for is recreation space. And then, so the definition of recreation comes into play. What's recreation? I don't know.
And what
chess?
they're using, what they're offering for recreation space is laughable.
Well, and mine is, and again, trying not to, I'm trying to judge because I also don't want to not have them do these spaces. I think those kinds of spaces built into projects are important that those developers provide. They're going to do it anyway because there's a market demand for those kinds of amenities within these structures.
Well, I'm
When they
not
get
talking
this
about the
done.
amenities. I'm talking about the strips of green space
Oh, sure.
at the alley where basically, other than walking the dog, what else is
Sure.
good for?
Well, what's happening, because again, rec spaces, it's almost like an afterthought.
Right,
And they're just maxing out the development
right,
and then they're trying to carve back out, hey, this should be the rec space. And that's
Right.
that was not the intent.
right.
But mine is if we have it and the intent is that it's accessible to the public, then it needs to be, I'm just gonna say, public adjacent, sidewalk adjacent and accessible for ambulatory or non-ambulatory individuals to gain access to that rec space from the sidewalks or from the streets. So if you're a pedestrian, you're walking down the street, you're able to step off into that, if that's something that's allowed. Where the courtyards, you can't get there if you're from the
Right.
public.
Reading this, chapter 97, I mean, I think the reason that they've gotten away with it is because it says that the applicant shall make an irrevocable offer of dedication of park and recreational land of the borough per the requirements of this section. And the borough may authorize the transfer of the land to a homeowners association or other appropriate third party, including but not limited to a nonprofit association or nonprofit corporation organized to acquire and maintain real property for the preservation, conservation, and stewardship of park and recreational land, or consistent with the borough's recreation plan as adopted from time to time by council. In lieu of dedicating park and recreational land to the borough, the applicant may elect to pay a fee in lieu to the borough consistent with the requirements in 97-38.1E below. So I think, because I still believe that what Alan and I are saying here is right, but I think that the problem is that in the past, the borough might not have been willing to take on any ownership of this public space or coordinate that. So I think there might be an internal mechanism missing because it is still a requirement here that they provide this.
Sure.
But I don't know if we're participating, so it's easier to just say, give us money and we'll put it in our park, because
Well, I think.
we don't want a parklet here.
Yeah,
'cause
but
we can't
everything you
handle it.
just read though, I think the key words were that you said land.
Right,
And then what Alan's saying is this is not land,
what, the swimming pool?
courtyard,
Oh, right,
this is rooftop. Yeah.
Yeah, that's.
yeah, no, that's.
So I mean,
And if it's not publicly accessible,
but
it
then,
doesn't
but
count.
then
Right,
either zoning or the attorneys have to stand up and say, land. Land means ground.
right,
Land doesn't mean your rooftop.
right.
Right,
But then, so that's what I'm saying is, that's where the argument is there. And that's why I'm saying it conflicts within there here in the statement. It asks for land in the front sentence.
I don't
but
think
then-
any of that conflicts, so I think the decisions that have been made might conflict,
Sure.
but I don't think it's the verbiage, but I am.
Well, I'm saying is the way our ordinance is written, it specifically says land. I think that's pretty clear. And if we've been arguing, that should be land.
Right,
All right, the applicant's been arguing, we have courtyards, and we're saying our ordinance, you just read it, mentions land like 5 times. It doesn't mention rooftops.
Right.
It mentions land. The Pennsylvania Municipal Planning Code says land, dedication of land suited for it. What I'm saying is where it conflicts with itself is when you look at the provisions say it's for the use of the inhabitants.
Have applicants used that as their?
I'm not sure what Brian is using for his argument, but they've used the
I-
courtyards as meeting the percentages of area.
I think what line 5 means is that they can't say, well, we own a lot 70 miles away and we're gonna let anyone can use that, but we're providing recreational space. It just means that it has to be
I think there's a.
available for
I think
them.
there's a distance prescribed in the
Right.
ordinance somewhere, that isn't, it's 2 blocks or 3 blocks, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
But, so I mean, I don't know, I don't feel that strongly feel about land. I mean, if you want to go ahead and just build a staircase from the
Well-
sidewalk to go up to the swimming pool so that everybody can go there, then it becomes public space.
No, but that's the part that I have a problem with.
Okay.
What I'm saying is this says you're creating it for the inhabitants of that development. It's not saying you're creating it for the public. And I'm saying,
But we are saying we're creating it for the public. That's what,
We don't
that's what
have-
Westchester Borough's point
Sure.
of view is.
that's not what this,
They
that's
have
not what the
labeled-
state,
The picture rooftop
I
courtyard public space.
I understand that. What I'm saying is, the problem with that is, it's not backed up by the law, and it's not backed up by intent, and it's discriminatory by people that rent, that they don't have the same privacy, security, and their own space. So you live in an apartment, and you're just telling me that Westchester University, a frat can come up and go use your pool, and you're saying, hey, it's rec space.
Well, nobody's gonna do that. I mean, nobody's gonna build a big apartment
Fine,
building.
and then, fine, no one would ever do that. When I was a kid, you never walked into a hotel and was like, hey, the swimming pool looks pretty
Oh,
cool.
what
Right?
hotels do.
Okay, I'm just saying is the part in the law, it's not about what I feel, all right? I feel like it'd be great if everybody had great opportunities. What I'm saying is, I'm not sure we're requiring it for the other uses and higher dollar places.
Yeah.
We get to apartments and we go, no, that's a public amenity. It's not a public. It says right here, it's for the inhabitants of that development. It doesn't say it's for the inhabitants of the public. So that's what Tom has to weigh in on, Tom Estee or Kristen, because when I'm reading this thing, it says you are allowed to ask for rec space or fee in lieu for space for the inhabitants of that development. That's very clear. It doesn't say you need to provide this and it's for the public.
I think you,
Now, that's the
if
difference
we
in the
could
public
wrap
space.
this Conversation up.
All right.
I think
I
you
see.
just need to do, as you mentioned,
Sure.
have a public statement,
Right.
take it to the borough
Yeah.
so they can take it to the attorneys and come.
Sure. And I think that's,
Get better language.
I think, Mayor, that's where I'm saying is when we ask for public space, 100% on board, public
Right.
space.
Right,
When we ask for rec space, that's not what rec space is.
right,
That's different.
right.
So what I'm saying is ask for the public space, accessible to the public.
Right.
Rec space doesn't say that.
Right.
It says for the inhabitants. So that's what I'm saying is I'm not sure what kind of ground we have to give away somebody else's.
Well, and it, like you said, it does say land.
Yeah.
So we need to,
Okay, well, you want to wait for Ramsey to come back or you want to start, Thomas, for president?
Yeah, let's go.
Thank you, Mayor.
And I was paying attention, but I was also doing a little bit of research on this maximum lot area. And so I was reaching out to some people. And so I only have one example right now, but I have a very clear example where they have a maximum lot area. This is in Durham, North Carolina. It's
Oh,
a
okay.
relatively recently
Sure.
passed ordinance. And it exists in their subdivision land development. I thought that's right on, but I would think that'd be zoning. But I have an example here on my computer where, the comp plan is talking about wanting smaller lots. And so this is the rationale for it. It's a 2023 update. And they have no minimum lot area, but they have maximum lot area. So it's an example. I'm gonna grab this mouse and see if I can.
You'll like it.
that's North Carolina,
The example that I
the photos,
That actually,
because they look like Westchester.
yes,
This is-
no, that's Westchester, that's
I'm
Westchester.
just saying.
Stinks were right.
Like, what? It's just-
I'm digging into precedent for maximum lot areas. And so we do have some examples.
You're spot on.
I nailed it, yeah.
Okay, so I have a few slides to go through. We talked about the comp plan's requirement of us to create a preservation ordinance, essentially. The underlying premise of this plan is that new development and preservation are complementary elements of the planning strategy. Great, comp plan set the stage for that in 2016. We're, catching up with that and trying to put together this. So, and I just added this note in here, we can draw what we want to see. We know the kind of characteristics we want, we can draw that easily. It's very difficult to figure out how to move forward. And I just did a real quick, it's a much bigger piece of research, but I highlighted a few dates. we adopted an extensive zoning ordinance in 1966. That's the first time Westchester had a zoning ordinance, and it was tied to federal grants, and it was across the country. It was part of the kind of Cold War strategies, starting with the Eisenhower administration, and developing our municipalities' infrastructure. And so you'll see municipalities across the country having almost identical zoning ordinances, and that's dating from those mid-60s. Okay, so Westchester got that in 1966. We redid our zoning, kind of whole cloth, in 1988, and that was some really wonderful leadership. And that's when we started with our preservation. Like, so the NC, the reason it doesn't say like R1, R2, like most of the country, like most places we work, is because they were talking about conservation, right? So they were talking about here, like we're trying to conserve, and they very explicitly, because there was a comp plan in the late 80s too, that was talking about, hey, how do we actually reverse so much of what we adopted in 1966? And as you guys all know, that's a zoning ordinance, that's a municipal, hundreds and hundreds of pages of of code that was overlaid on top of our borough. So just at this point, we can draw what we want. It's very difficult to sort through all these hundreds and hundreds of pages and figure out, okay, well, how do we make that possible, right? How do we actually figure out how to get this? So 88, redid our zoning, but so much of the language still was from the 60s, that 1968. In 2001, that was the next time that we kind of looked into our zoning and made a number of revisions. That's when we got, for example, the historic carriage house ordinance. That was in 2001. And then it wasn't until our more recent 2020 zoning update that we looked at that again. And really at that point, there was very little change that happened. It was really kind of a cleaning up. So we've got a lot of pages. A lot of that text dates back to the 60s. Some dates back to 88. But when I'm going to be flipping through some of these requirements, and there we go. But just bear that in mind. So I made a couple different plans for us, just to overlay like graphics. Back in 2020, we were talking about this with the zoning update. That was the fourth zoning update, 60s, 80s, 2001, 2020, right? So in 2020, we were looking at, hey, where is there like demolition abatement? How can we expand some of our preservation work? And we met with Corey Kegris. Corey was the state preservation coordinator of Eastern PA. So it was all back in, I don't know if we ever met with Corey in person. That might have all been during COVID times. But he came to, I think, 2 of our meetings in the sessions where we're looking at zoning. And he talked to us about the fact that, hey, style and character, anything architectural has to fit within, in Pennsylvania, other states are different, in Pennsylvania have to fit within a historic district. Okay, great. So if we're going to want to address articulation, fenestration, windows, material, anything like that, anything other than area bulk setbacks, then it needs to be part of a historic preservation district or historic district. So here are 2 of ours. Now it's not including the heart, and the heart sticks out a little bit. And I think it's good to give the heart a little bit of space. So here's our downtown, and then the larger district here. And when you overlay it on top of the plan that shows the buildings, it jumps out at you, right? You can tell the areas that are traditionally, you can look at the breaks, right? There's the break on New Street, and there is the, that kind of 60 development on the other side of it. Okay, so we've looked at this page. I'm just gonna flip to the next one. I think to highlight, hey, how do we look at what would need to change to see some of the things we want to get built? Let's look at projects that are actually going forward. And so we looked at, hey, this would be preferable to what's being developed there today. This is in keeping with this plan of this development by CJ and Ray many years ago. And they talked about the number of variances, the amount of heartache that it took, and just the years and years of trying to get this thing approved. Okay, but this plan, back to that point here, right? it's really easy to draw the things that we all know we want. It's a lot harder to figure out how all the variants that they needed and how to move forward in 2025 to doing this. Okay, so town center districts. So if we overlay the districts, we looked at this page a second ago, here's our Burger King site. So let's zoom in on that. If this, just for clarity's sake, if we're trying to figure out what would this preservation ordinance look like, let's look at a living, breathing example. So if we were to look at these, you know, an alternate plan for the site, here's the town center, very basic zoning ordinance, you know, lot area with build to line, so on and so on. Okay, so let's look at how this, if let's say we were to tie it to an architectural care that we all thought was appropriate, that we could propose to our council and say, yes, we think that the buildings, for example, that look like this, these buildings that we can point to across our borough that make up most of our borough, we like these buildings. How do we make it legal to build these buildings again? Then we could pull the levers on some of these where it says, hey, your minimum lot area is 2,500. We could say, actually, if we wanted, you know, to be able, these to be their own lots, right? This has to be a condo. And that's going to be, I think, a later conversation of what is appropriate. Right now, there's a lot of things that go through the condo regime, which postdates when these ordinances were written. So you'll see this kind of how the condo basically undermines the way the ordinance is written, and you think, well, why is that? So where we have a lot area up here, you can get around that with some more condo regimes. Okay, so here's our town center district regulations. And let's say we wanted to allow for 14-foot, 16-foot, 18-foot wide homes, you know, if they meet certain standards. So if that were to be the case, then you could say, okay, well, we don't have a minimum lot area. Because to your point earlier, building code is actually going to dictate you have to have your 5-foot rear and side yard setbacks to have openings. Right? That's just a building code point of thing. A lot of things I think people get concerned about with zoning. Oh, is the fire truck going to get back there? Is this going to, and that there are other areas of code that deal with a lot of these issues. Okay. So, one of those things, and I'll get back to it, that I think would be a really valuable threshold if we're trying to lower the barriers to this kind of development is durability. What kind of buildings, you know, it's so important that we address attainability and affordability. And we need to address that today, and we need to address that in the future. And the attainable and affordable buildings we're building today aren't going to last into the future, because a lot of them are going to have systemic issues that are probably going to make them not worth renovating in about 45 years. Most of our historic fabric is built durably. Therefore, it's been paid off. It's a homeowner that's not even paying a mortgage after 30 years. And then that's future generations can inherit that, they can sell that. And so it's important to build durably. How, you know, most of this fabric in here in our historic district, that's actually built out of brick, and it's not one brick thick. You can see rayons here, beautiful. It is veneer, right? So this is essentially siding. It's working independently of the structure of the building, and it's tied back with like little hooks or little steel pieces. My house is 2 bricks, and a lot of the houses here, 3 bricks. And so different ways of tying durability into these structures. So I personally think that's a really important threshold that ties aesthetics and durability together. One of the reasons we love all these buildings up here is that they are built with brick, and you can see that with the proportions of the windows. You can see that with the arched openings. And so just tying it back to that, there are some costs that are tied to that. So maybe your upfront costs are 20% more, let's say, but you're building a building that's not going to not really be worth inheriting in 45 years. You're building a building that could last 200 years. Okay. So let's say that we wanted those characteristics for this. I think, you know, we could say, hey, for a building like that, we don't need a lot area minimum. A lot width, that'll just match whatever the house is, 14, 16, 18. Obviously, if it's going to be a side, if it's a twin, let's say it's 2 twins and they're 14, so you get 28, but you need another 10 feet, 5 feet on either side. That's building code. That's not zoning code. Rear yard minimum, you could just put that in as 5 feet. That's what the existing town center is right now. Height maximum is 45. You know, I think with these structures, they top out at 3 stories. So you could say, hey, height maximum is 3 stories. Impervious coverage, we could just adopt exactly what they have in the town center. So we're just looking at this site here and we're saying, hey, could we meet these requirements? And I think comfortably we could. That's not a big deal. That's 1 page. We got a ton of pages to go through. Okay, so one of the things that we often see are projects coming forward as condos. And I just want to hit it head on because it's an interesting situation where this is a Matlack. This is that development on Matlack Street. And these were 18, I think, maybe it was a varying, but I think one of these units was 18 feet wide. And so when it came in front of us, I was under the impression that even though I know this happens other places, that based on the fact that we have a minimum lot width of 20 feet, that we would not allow for an 18-foot wide townhouse to be built. Now, I'm all in favor of 18-foot wide townhouses. But it was the inconsistency of saying, hey, you only let it have a 20-foot wide lot, which is why when they were building on Washington Street, their first proposal was all 20 feet. And we said, well, maybe do an 18. They said, are we allowed to do that? So even though it's, you know, a condo, right? So the lot is not that. What are we talking about? Are we talking about lot or are we talking about building? Okay. When our previous building and zoning officer was here, he said, hey, the use is single family. But included in that use is attached townhomes, attached homes, right? It's attached, semi-detached, and detached. And because attached is allowed, then you can put more than one on there. Well, if you also look at the zoning regulation, it says 1 primary use. So if you bring that up, okay, well, the primary use is attached townhomes. So it's this discrepancy of you're saying a 20-foot lot is our minimum lot width, but at the same time, you can put multiple of these smaller ones if it's a condo regime. Okay, that's one example. Okay, let's look at this lot right here, for example, because here's an example where they're looking at this one. You could say, okay, well, they were measuring lot width and confusing building type with use, conflating building type with use. Over here, this is that recent project. We have, you know, here are lot width minimums, the different uses attached, they're saying is a use and it's 20 foot minimum. Build to side yard accessory. So this is for the principal building, right? So there's a rear yard minimum of 20 feet. So you look at this and you say, well, okay, well, where's the rear yard? Is this the rear yard? Well, this has to be the front yard. This is facing the street. This is Patton Alley. And the reason it makes sense is because we're looking at building in this case. So we're saying, okay, well, the building has a rear yard of 20 feet. This building is a rear yard of 20 feet. But actually, we're in this situation where because it's condo and single family, we're using them. However, we're using them in different ways. And that inconsistency is not doing us any good right here. So that's one thing to keep in mind is that all of these developments we see going forward are using condo regime as a way of getting around these zoning ordinances.
Well, it was much more favorable with the impervious coverage too, because of the lot sizes, the percentage. So with that being one property, it allowed a greater density in there.
Because of the lot width. That's
No, for their overall lots greater than 5,000 square feet, that kind of stuff. So it was when we looked.
we would have had great. No, I would push back on that. I think so. Let's look at that real quick then, because it should be right here, right?
Mhm.
Lots over 50, lots between, lots less than. You can get a higher coverage with a smaller lot. Lots less than 4,000 square feet, you can get an 80% in an NC2. So it could have been the case if they had subdivided this. The reason that would be a problem, right? What if they had come forward and said, hey, we're actually going to subdivide, make these 2 lots. With a median lot size, they could have gotten away with that. Not gotten away in a bad way, but they could have done that. But then they would have had to have a side yard of 10 feet, 5 feet on each side. So that would have gotten rid of one of their units. But when we were first looking at that, they had to do pervious pavers to meet their impervious. But if that had been 2, they could have complied. Okay, So let's look at off-street parking for a second. You know, here, this is from our zoning. And it says, you know, every unit needs to have 2 off-street if it's gonna be single family attached, detached, single or 2 family, right? Everything has to have 2 units. And that's what we're looking at here in our NC2. So again, we're going back to this and we're saying, hey, how can we get something other than the big development that we're seeing get built? Which they have to do, what is it, about 1 parking space per dwelling unit at the moment, maybe a little bit less for the current machine. I mean, with the updated zoning, it would be 1.2 per studio. It's mostly studios. So I think that, okay, well, if we want to promote, if we want to allow 14, 16s, and 18s, first, let's make it legal. Second, you know, by right, not as a condo regime. We could say, hey, if it's going to be one of these, we could lower that parking to 1 parking space. And you could even say, let's see, and maybe you could add a stipulation if you're worried about bedroom count. 14, 16s, and 18s are all going to have 2s. You might be able to squeeze a 3rd bedroom in an 18, but you could just, if you were worried about that, 14, 16s, and 18s, just given the dimensions, are all going to have 2 bedrooms. Right, Jim?
Mm-hmm.
And it could be the case, let's say, okay, we're Pete, and we're saying, hey, we're actually going to be creating our own private streets in here. That's going to have off-street parking. Can I use that off-street parking as part of my parking number? And I would say, yes, we should allow that. Okay, parking. This is general design standards from our zoning code. And this is where we start to deal with a lot of paperwork. Like, why we know that this would be a better development. What are going to be the things that are going to get in our way? A number 1 thing is going to be buildings are going to need to face the street. Only if it's a lot that's can't face the street, can't face the alley, unless it's a condo regime. But then you're looking through here and these aren't alleys, right? These don't pre-exist. And so new streets and sidewalks, this is general design standards. It's about 2 pages. Ray Ott added it to the very beginning. It didn't exist prior. He wasn't making up these things, but he was kind of consolidating them. And so if you read through the 2 pages of general design standards, you're going to find about 4 or 5 different stipulations that are going to make this impossible. So that would have to be addressed. And how do we enable this kind of development, which is, again, let's look at this, for example. That, you know, we all know that we like this street that Ray Ott created. It won a preservation award. And yet, here, this is not meeting our minimum width for a street. It doesn't meet our minimum width for an alley. If it were a street, it would need sidewalks on either side. If it were a street, it would need to be about 4 times as wide. So there are these, this is one of the, you know, many things that they had to hit their head up against the wall to create. And yet we can look at this and say, hey, this is the character of Westchester. And we know that in part because Ray was going to Darlington Street and measuring it for these dimensions. Okay, this is from the Saldo. Lots and lot sizes. All lots shall have frontage on and direct access to a street existing or proposed. Yeah, so all lots have to face a street. So you're not allowed to subdivide. So going back up to our example here, that was part of it. One of the many reasons why they couldn't subdivide these off and make these fee simple lots, that they had to do a condo regime. Sidewalks, I already mentioned that. And then this is also from the Saldo. New alley should be a minimum width of 16 feet, right? And that's definitely not 16 feet, and you'd also have to have the setbacks in there, so. Okay, this is continuation of design standards for streets coming from the zoning code, but you'll find similar language in both the zoning and the Saldo, where it probably should be cleaned up a little bit because they repeat themselves, and also every you know, a little bit slightly different language in the Saldo than from the zoning. But private streets, right? So again, we're trying to figure out how do we enable development that we all know that would be much preferable. This would be preferable for the borough. What are the roadblocks? And we can get past the initial zoning things, right? We looked at that. Like all this stuff, it's going to be easy to comply with. We can come up with new standards that fit buildings that we think are appropriate. And I think Borough Council will agree with us. Condo, we need to talk about that more. And it's when we start getting into these standards around streets that something like this becomes a lot harder to do. Or something like the example right here was, required so many variances. Okay, so I think there are a couple different ways we could go about this. I think probably the number one way would be, we know that buildings fronting alleys, actually back up just for a second. Interestingly, if you look at the street and alley, there's a book where they were writing them down as they were being platted. And so you look at starting in the maybe the earliest is in like the really early 1800s. But for about 100 years, it said street or alley, because they were somewhat interchangeable. And if you actually look at the old maps, you'll see that many, if not most, of our alley structures were torn down. And they were torn down because during this time they were illegal, right? Starting in 1966, it was no longer a compliant use. And so I don't know, I know in Philadelphia, they made a lot of those things illegal back in the 1920s for good reason. We didn't have power, we didn't have running water, we didn't have, septic or any of these things. So it made a lot of sense to not allow them. We have all that stuff, fits in a cavity wall. Okay, so I think that we can deal with the zoning elements here. I think when we're talking about new streets and alleys and how do these things front the, how do we allow for this tight kind of human scale development that we all think is going to be beneficial to the borough, we're going to have to get creative by either saying, let's adopt a new public street type. We call it a muse. And interestingly, there's Wilmot Muses right here. And back in the day, muse was another name for kind of a service street for carriages. And has a history back in England and back in the 1920s, those were all turned into these beautiful residential streets. Some of the probably the most photographed streets in London are these different little carriage house streets. And we have one behind the Farmers and Mechanics building. It's still called Muse. It's our one street, it's not called Alley. So we could say something like, hey, these new streets can be developed to front onto Muse, and then you could have characteristics of that. So we can kind of sidestep this street question and just say, hey, we know we like this. I'm going to call that a Muse, and I'm going to talk about its spatial definitions. And if Pete Stas wants to build a replica of that, I think that's great. Let's call it a Muse. I think another way of moving forward would be to say something like, these new structures, 14, 16, 8 foot wide, what varying needs going to be, they're going to last a long time. They're going to be beautiful. They're going to be contributing to the character of the borough. Hey, you can build those to front alley. You can build these structures on their own lot that fronts an alley. So I think one of those two approaches, either calling something a muse or allowing them to be subdivided front alley, is going to be our best path forward to trying to allow something like this. And I just want to say too, as I got into this, I really wanted to have something that would be a little bit clearer to say, yes, we want to go forward with this. But I do think tying it to a real project is really important to really get down into the weeds as to what would it take to create this here. And I think too, with this ordinance, we're going to probably be in the best place if we worked with a developer to actually see if something like this is possible. Not like it, we know it's possible. It's like maximum lot areas. Durham as an example right there. We could absolutely do it if there was a municipal will to do it. So I think similarly here, we could preempt this and try to write legislation that does essentially what I haven't read here. And I think that's a good approach. But I also think what might be even better is to work directly with a developer and say, hey, developer, what if it's opposed to doing your Burger King site, for example, we looked at something like this. We think that this is going to be better for the borough, way less density, single family homes, attainable in that their size is so much smaller. It's a lot less expensive to build a 14-foot wide townhouse than a 22 or 20. So I think working directly with a developer in this case could really help us shape this legislation, even if it pushes it back another month or two before we actually have something that we can vote on. Okay, real quick, without taking too much of your time, I just want to look at this other site that that was Town Center, that's right here. So then let's look real quick at this NC2 example. We know that they have to avoid all this stuff too, but I just wanted to highlight some of these other this is basically the NC2 zoning table. So the street stuff is all going to be the same, and it's just going to be these slightly different, categories here. So I think we could similarly say, hey, we don't need a lot area minimum for these buildings, because we know that they're going to be contributing to the character of the borough, and we can point to 100 examples where they're really good. I think similarly, right, we could say, hey, the side yard is 0 if attached, or 5 foot if it's not attached and it's not fronting public right of way. That difference there, just for clarity's sake, the reason that a building code wouldn't require a 5 foot setback is that, this is fronting a right of way. But when that's a private property line, a structure would not be able to have any openings adjacent to that unless it was 5 foot back. So that's where it makes sense to, on the rear and the sides, say, hey, let's just adopt that 5 foot. We can put it in zoning for clarity's sake. It would be there in all of our building codes either way. Again, 3 stories. And I think, we can take, okay, lots less than 4,000 square feet of 80% maximum. I think we could just adopt that smaller lot square footage. And I just wanted to highlight this, like I'd shown this last time, but I didn't put kind of the 2 and 2 together, that zoning doesn't cover materials or elevations. We can have a project that we care about, a project where it doesn't even make sense with the condo regime that, like, okay, the building has to be, where's your rear yard? Are you allowed to put principal buildings in the rear yard? No.
Yeah.
But we're in a situation where they have buildings in the rear yard. Well, okay, but in one case, we're looking at the lot as rear yard. Another one, we're basing the rear yard off the building. And really, we're just trying to get something that works well for the lot. But that's that ambiguity of like lot and building that I think comes in when people are chasing the condo regime. Okay. Zoning doesn't cover facades, right? And so we can be talking all day long about, hey, we want something in the character of the borough, and then somebody shows up with this, and it's really not in keeping with the character of the borough. And we can point to examples. Okay, no, actually, let's look at your neighbors. And so we kind of drew that up for them as an example. But really, we have no influence, or we have no voting, anything, right? Like the purview of the openings, the materials, vinyl siding, it could be the cheapest thing the IRC lets you do. 2x4 construction. I was seeing something recently, Jim, you would have loved it. No, I'm just kidding, you wouldn't have liked it. But it was an affordable housing hack. Maybe it was just 2x4 with like foam on the outside. There was a couple other things that were like new that was just like, it was so cheap. I had a great meme that I should have added in here if I forgot, but it was Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin has a quote, something of like, being like, you're not going to appreciate the short-term gains of cheap, down the road. And it comes, like, okay, we can build something that's not going to be worth inheriting in 35 years. Okay, so all that to say, we know what we want. We know that we can't affect the facades, which is really what, largely what we're talking about here, unless we're part of a historic district. So let's piggyback on one of our existing historic districts. And I think we have the beginnings of how to deal with the zoning area here. I think the thing that's going to show up almost immediately for both this project and this project are the streets, the street right-of-ways, buildings fronting streets, the inability to subdivide unless the building has a street frontage. And I think that we're going to be best suited if we pair up with a developer and we say, hey, how can we create a counter proposal with you for, let's say, Burger King site? So I think this is my last, may I have one more. I think what we should do is I think we should pioneer the 14, 16, 18, and maybe 20, because it's so common, townhouses. And not that there are so many good historic building types in the borough. The reason I'm highlighting these is because these are the ones, not the 20, but the 14, 16, 18 that are currently illegal. If you want to go build a beautiful single family home, our zoning is set up well for that. If you want to go build a relatively large twin, let's say a twin, our zoning is already relatively well set up for that. These are the ones that are more attainable, that are more affordable, and have been illegal since the 60s. So these are the ones we really want to focus on. The characteristics that I think are going to be most important is durability. I would hang my hat on this one. I think there's going to be a fair amount of pushback, but I really do think that tying these structures to the 2 brick thick exterior wall is gonna be baking durability and beauty into these buildings. For yes, more money, but let's say 20% more money and a much longer lifespan. So I think tying it to 2 bricks thick, I'm gonna push for that one. I know some people are gonna push back. I think tying the openings to being structural brick or a wood lintel, maybe not wood, but maybe it has to be, these are pages from the HARB. And you can see where they're talking about, hey, these are some notes on shutters. This is what shutters in our borough look like. Let's have shutters look like this. And so I think we could kind of piggyback on a little bit of some of the HARB guidelines, minimally, right? We don't want to, but you know, if we're going to say 14, 16, 18, if you're going to add shutters, have them be like this. If you're going to have, you know, and then you could say, hey, so that's just another note on shutters. Shutters should be able to, even if they're not actually operable, make them so that they cover half the window. Yeah.
Not to interrupt, but I recall the interaction with Corey Kegeries.
Yes.
Differently,
Okay.
in that, is if you really want to, my recollection, have a strong position in terms of not allowing destruction of older properties and control over the design standards. But what you need to do is to create a second historic district, a softer version.
And that is that's what I'm outlining right here.
Yeah, okay.
So I would say that demolition abatement and design guidelines kind of have to be 2 different buckets.
Yeah,
And-
I agree, but I'm just saying that
Yes.
you sort of outlined it as being, well, I mean, there is the larger historic district and there's the Harb district, but I think that what he was talking about was create a new district.
What he would say, so
I could be wrong.
no, I believe you're absolutely right. And I was emailing back and forth with him and I had some private calls with him too. I think that's exactly what he said. What I'm showing here, actually, neither one of these is the Harb district. These are districts, this larger one, I don't know the history of the smaller one. The larger one happened under Ray Ott's leadership. And these 2 districts actually have no legislative ties currently, I believe. We should confirm that with the solicitors. But they exist as districts, but there's actually nothing that gets tied to them. So I would say, hey, we have a district in place already. We can create that, and it wouldn't be called, I don't think, a HARB. I'm not sure what it'd be called. Maybe.
But where is that, the picture you said Ray Ott did on the lower right one? What street is
This one
that?
right here.
Mhm. What street is that? Is that
It's-
over there behind the Burger King?
Yep.
I was gonna say, that's gonna break your heart because this is where that large apartment complex is gonna go. And we have such a beautiful example of new development
Right.
fitting in.
That's my favorite. And then you go behind that, you have to do a couple of turns to
That's
get
right,
back
That's the
there.
one. Yeah.
And it's it's like a
Isn't it wonderful?
hidden gem back there.
So I'll
See the back of the house on Dean Street
Right.
and it's just
One day I was over that and I was years ago and I was
breathtaking.
like, when did this come?
Yeah,
out?
no.
So,
don't forget that because
yeah,
that hidden aspect, that hidden gem, that's such a part of historic neighborhoods.
right.
Philadelphia still has a lot of
Pine Street and all the,
Exactly.
yeah,
that whole area in Society Hill is stunning.
right.
That's one of, when I talked about being able to address some of these, you can't do what Ray Ott did breaks, let's say, 15 different rules. And we can deal with the zoning ones. It's the ones that deal with that street makeup and fronting streets. I think that's where it's gonna be. You've got a pile of rules that are this thick that the federal government asked us to adopt in 1966, and we've changed them over the years, but it's largely the same. So we can draw what we know we like. We all like this. It
Yeah.
matches Darlington, but it's really hard to figure out how to make it legal again. And so I think that's where I'm trying to get back to.
And
How
this-
do we find that path forward and maybe working with
Yeah,
Pete's status, maybe sitting down with him and saying, hey, Pete, this is what we're trying to move forward. Would you be interested in working with us? Maybe you don't want to build, very likely this is not going to work for you, but just help us think through this project.
Mhm.
I think it's a great idea.
And even the ones on, Chestnut Street there, those townhouses with the walls, and you have to go through the gate, and walk up to the townhouse. Who was the builder on that?
It's not lovely.
Yeah, it's lovely. Who was the builder?
So I kept that, I don't know, but
Yeah.
they did a couple other really good things.
Yeah.
And if you
Yeah.
look at the rules and regulations around, say, walls and
Yeah.
fronts, buildings,
Right.
we have a whole page of why you can't do that. Wouldn't it? I've spent way too many everybody spends tons of volunteer hours, Jimmy, sorry, I should have, but like so many hours going through these
Right.
codes because I see these beautiful things. The walls, the arched openings, that's a good example. The other ones in town. And I think, oh, how do we enable that? And then you realize, oh, that shows up 5 times in the Saldo, 5 times in the zoning, different places, why you can't do that. But if this is supposed to be serving the government and the people, you'd think that we can go dig through here and let's just start pulling that stuff out, or at least saying, maybe not pull it out, but at least say, hey, if you're gonna build this townhouse right here, Rick, then it doesn't have to follow the rules. Right, so you could even leave the bad rules in place if it's too politically hot to touch them, or too hard, probably. But if you're gonna build a little house like this, then you don't have to comply. So I just 2 more quick things, and one of them was just a cautionary tale. These are from the Harb.
Talking about cautionary tales, you can't find real shutters anymore.
It's difficult.
It's very
Sure.
difficult. We had to replace real wood shutters on the
Yeah.
building, and we actually had to have them made from the Amish.
Yeah,
There's no crafts people. it's hard to find real bricklayers anymore.
I think you're,
So,
I think
we
it's,
talk about 20%, but it would probably be more like 50%.
um,
So I'm in the process of building now and renovating in another town.
I would push back on you because I think that it would be 50% maybe for your first one. But I think by the time you're doing your second one, it would be much less. And I think in part because I'm actually working on.
Well, if you're doing more than one, sure, I would agree,
Yeah.
but I'm just saying, the costs are
Yeah,
astronomical.
You're right, costs are high. So, okay, 2 very quick cautionary things with the HARB guidelines. One is going to be the guidelines themselves, I think, simplify the realities in ways that aren't like, this is a great structure, I believe. I think it's beautiful.
It's beautiful.
If you were to look over at the guidelines as to new construction, I guess what I'm saying is we don't want to just adopt hard, even like,
Sure.
for example, they're going to say, hey, you need to have a 3-2, 3-2-3 proportion. Okay, well, that doesn't really work on the skinny buildings, especially with modern egress codes for windows. So modern egress codes are larger than they were even 8 years ago. I think they updated that, the 2nd and 3rd story egress sizes. And so the HARB guidelines very nicely stack like window, window, door, window, window, window. Walk around the borough, most of it is not that. When you get wider buildings, you can start playing those games, but mostly you'll end up with something like this with the 2 bottom. Sometimes it's door, window, window, and then 3-3. Kind of like this, they'll often be offset from one another. And then with the skinnier, which is really what we're talking about, 14, 16, 18s, what you'll see is shutters basically touching. And so you don't see that kind of proportion that they're trying to outline here. Okay, another thing in here. So HARB, the Secretary of the Interior guidelines on preservation, it's really interesting. There was a whole, modernist movement, and then this kind of trepidation. They were very timid about claiming like aesthetic value, like we like this, so we want to build this. And so nationally, internationally, what you see is you'll see the historic structure and then something that doesn't look like the historic structure next to it. And they're saying it's sympathetic because it's like this, but then as the pedestrian, you just see this crazy glass building or whatever it is next to it. And then you read the fine print and it says, it's sympathetic because, and they have some kind of esoteric reason of why it's sympathetic. So you still see that kind of stuff a lot. So I'm just going to point out in here, like I love our HARB. I'm so supportive of the HARB, but you'll find little things in here. For example, it will say, the design of a new building should not be an exact replica of any existing historic building within the district. And it comes back to this kind of trepidation of, I want to be really careful that we're not replicating things. try as hard as you would like, you are not going to be able to replicate something. When you're gonna go through the process, the tradespeople, you're finding a different Amish worker to do, your shutters, whatever. Let's not be concerned about replication. That's not our concern right now. Similarly, this is, that was number 3, this is new construction. Shutters and blinds are generally discouraged on additions and on new buildings. It's from the same kind of timid sense of like, we don't want to be thought of as like podunk or like we're doing like, I don't know, like reenactments in Lancaster, right? So like they'll put verbiage in here to say like, oh, we don't want to do that. I would say, let's be just unafraid to say, we love this building. The general population loves this building. If we could say, build that building right there, it's not going to be a replica, so don't worry about that part. It would be great. And shutters are lovely. And so let's just allow for shutters in and out. And so similarly, you'll see, so this is right next to that project up here, right there. So it's the next door neighbors down. And they're 2-story structures. And you can see how these have been kind of ganged together like this. So similar, you'll see kind of the, academic approach to this, and I'll say, don't combine windows. And I can kind of get that, but like, these are all lined up all nicely. And that's nice. And then, this is the hard guidelines. But this is a historic structure. That one doesn't really line up with that one. That one doesn't line up with that one. These are ganged. So I think rather than saying, for example, let's take some pages from the HARB and dictate that, we'd be better off saying, really what we want is that brick, durable facade. If it's going to be a wider window, hey, arch that opening, right? And just that will make that much more pleasing. So that's the beginning of it. I was hoping I would have more for you all this evening, but I do think that given the complexities of the streets and alleys and fronting and lots, and do we want to go the condo? Do we as a borough want to say, hey, if you want to do a nice development, all has to be condo? There are drawbacks of condo regimes. Insurance costs are a lot more for the construction loans. Moving forward with condo regimes, there are strings attached that maybe we don't want. So I would propose that we talk with a developer, continue this conversation, figure out with real world examples like this one, or this one, how do we make these by right?
Sure.
Outstanding.
Yeah, very nice, Thomas. Yeah, I did have some questions because I think you made some very good and then raised some really interesting pieces there. But with the historic, with the HARB, there's a national, there's a state, and then from local certainly can decide things are, there's historic buildings and then there's historic districts.
Yes.
So we could, or the borough could, is it the borough's HARB? Who can define an area and say, hey, the borough is a historic borough or historic district?
We have 4 maps right now, I believe. One of them is HARB. One of them is university, and this was the oldest historic thing. It's not just university, but it was like back from the 60s, I think, or in the 80s. So there are 2 that exist, and then these 2 are the 2 that aren't currently being used. It would be as if you had an NC1 district that just had nothing going on. So I believe it is the case that these are 2 existing historic districts that we could start with that have no legislation tied to them. I talked to.
Where are they? I can't.
Where would you find the maps of them?
Well, love your maps, your colored maps here, but I can't tell from here where they are in the town.
Yeah, so these 2 maps, if you go to the zoning, what would it be? It would be like zoning maps, and then it would be like historic resources. There are 2 maps that.
No, where are these 2 areas on your, what streets are they?
It's the whole town.
Well, I don't
That you
know.
were pointing to.
Right, well, you can
Oh,
see
you
where
are.
my mouse is. It's right, all this color.
I think
is
we
the
have
outside.
basically 2 levels. The one that's outlined here in pink is one. A lot of it overlaps the town center.
Yep.
And then the other area, which is bordered in this
That's right.
peach color, is also one. But that's it expands itself a lot more and goes into some of those MC neighborhoods, into those homes that were built in the early 1900 era. And still, I like the idea of being able to protect those neighborhoods and the quality within those neighborhoods, so.
So two last very quick thoughts. One, I talked to Ray Ott when we were doing the 2020 zoning update. He mentioned this because we were talking about preservation. And I believe we should ask him again, but I remember strongly that what he said was, we had the opportunity to create this district, this larger district. And at the time they were thinking about abatement, demolition abatement, but they never created the legislation to go with it. So he was basically setting the stage for us to do this. The second thought is back to Alan's point when he said, Corey said, hey, with design standards, it's got to be a new harbor. Great, we get that.
Right.
For abatement, he said, that's still up in the air, and he cited some Pennsylvania Supreme Court cases on demolition abatement. Basically, if it's not on the federal, what would it be, the Federal Historic Buildings List, which is different than the state, that there are some strings attached to. But if it's not on that federal list of historic structures, then in the state of Pennsylvania, it could go as far as the Supreme Court as, can you tear it down or not? So the best way to approach demolition abatement is carrots. To Corey's point, how do you enable, and that's actually why I threw in this last slide, which I forgot I threw in. This was Ray Ott's map where he was pointing out, and I don't have the legend over here, but these are all the different buildings which have different, 1 or 2 apartments in them. And to Corey's point, that's going to be your best way to stop these buildings from being knocked over. Give homeowners, not anybody else, but homeowners the ability to rent out a room. Because currently you can't just rent out a room. If you want to rent out a room to somebody, there are actual, stipulations that you're not really meeting with the zoning code. But if you look at our map right here, so much of the reason, or I would argue, and I think many others would too, that we've been able to preserve the character of our borough is that we actually do have all these little rental units in there. And what we would hate to see happen is outside investors buying homes and renting out rooms. Because then it's stacked against homeowners. But if what you were to say is a homeowner can rent out a room, now you've actually stacked the cards against the outside investor. The outside investor can rent out a house as a house. You, a homeowner, I can live in it and I can rent out a room, right? And so I just added this one last piece because I was thinking of Corey's words about demolition abatement. So I think that's a piece of the puzzle that we just can't forget.
Agree completely.
Okay.
So I think the next step would be to talk more seriously with a potential developer. What do you
Sure.
think about that, Jim?
Sure, no, I'd be glad to ask Pete to sit down with us, and then we can see if he's interested, and then he has the ability to maybe run performance and that type of stuff, so find out.
Very likely he's not interested in this lot, but he might even be interested down the road on other lots.
Well, I think
it's
he's interested in continuing to develop within the borough, so.
Exactly.
And I
yeah.
think whatever we can do to kind of help everybody get on the same
That's
page
right.
ourselves with developers and
Mhm.
understanding their perspective and then how everybody can benefit from that sitting down.
Yep,
That's definitely worthwhile.
perfect.
Thank you very much for all that work.
Yeah.
And then I think I'd like to continue that at least at the next work session to understand where or how that we could put stuff into place
Yeah, let's do that.
and what those pieces are. I do think, thank you. I do think the ability to do, thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
I think the ability to allow for a more narrow unit, like the 14, 16, 18s, I think makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
And I think anything we could do to promote homeownership also good. Anything we could do to promote quality or durable materials and buildings also good. And yeah, a lot of the pieces like the continuous foam on the outside of a building, it's just intended to meet energy codes. So energy codes are a driving thing. So we have one piece of it's like the accountant's designing a car. You're just not necessarily going to end up with the best looking car. So the continuous insulation on side, going to a 2x6 wall gets rid of the insulation and puts it inside the cavity. But I like the idea of more durable materials. I think because there's a big difference between building something and building something well, or doing something, like you said, it's actually a contributing resource, contributing.
And I also think it would be if I were to walk you around town, no, not walk you around, if we were to walk around town together, just point out the difference between veneer brick
Mhm.
and load-bearing brick, there's
Sure.
a nuance, right?
Sure.
You all of a sudden start to see the arches, you
Mhm.
see that, oh, you get to the top of the wall, and I can actually create that little bit of an eave profile by corbelling those bricks out. There's a depth to the window jambs.
Sure.
And so there's a bunch of aesthetic qualities
No,
that
sure.
get tied to that thicker brick wall.
No, I
And
agree.
as soon as you go to the single,
Yeah.
even just like the header courses, right? Like you go to the history center, that's a Flemish bond. You can do a Flemish bond when you get 2 bricks thick. It's amazing.
Oh, yeah. The two white, that's double white is awesome. And the triple was even better, but it really is again, probably driven by dollar, but I like if you can incentivize or allow a denser development
right.
so they get 3 or 4 more buildings into what they could have gotten 2.
Yeah.
Maybe the willingness to put better materials into it's there. And I
I
think,
agree. I think you have to be able to
yeah,
incentivize.
you have to incentivize
builders
that
to do
development.
it, and by being able to put more units in, it's
Mhm.
the only way that they're gonna feel compelled to.
Sure. So I think, so much there, digest that, but I think we continue that conversation. It's awesome. I guess there are any other issues on old stuff, but I think the new stuff, just to touch on those, 700 South High Street, where are we timing wise? I've been trying to follow the conversations, relative to the other, committees and council.
Mhm.
Where are we relative to, a timeline and what is our obligation there?
Well, Sean asked RVE for a traffic review.
Yes.
And that has not, I don't think that's come back yet.
Sure.
He's talking to council about next steps, and then they're trying to, I think they are they're attempting, first plan was to do a conditional use in August, but Sean
Sure.
believes that it'll be in September.
Okay.
I don't think they've asked for an extension yet for that, like to
Okay.
September.
Well, in general, my opinion, reading through, I think you and Cole did a nice job on it, and I think it's very tough. It's not an actual specific project. I think as a general overview of 0 to 5, 5 to 10, 10 to 15, and how things are moving forward, I think it's great to be able to see that, and it's great to see that they're actually thinking about that in that kind of time frame. I think it's almost most appropriate that we provide almost an equal tier type of review of it, which is we can certainly appreciate that and just from my standpoint, I think what they have potentially coming forward is a lot of great things about it. I think and they've named it even in their summary, when they have specific projects, they're going to submit those for a review.
Right.
And so I think the idea of as individual projects come up there, that we're going to have the opportunity to take a look at those and make comment are good. I think in the bigger picture things, we can see areas that aren't addressed, like the intersection of Rosedale High, or like, hey, now that you've created a new pedestrian path by getting rid of Church, and now you have a new pedestrian link across Rosedale in the middle of the block, how is that student traffic being addressed? When you look at the perimeter and those perimeter edges where it impacts the borough, how are we maintaining, making sure? And I think that's what Tom was referring to relative to the tree commission and sidewalks and so on. So I think we can almost respond at the same bigger picture level and write a review that basically we would recommend. I mean, just me thinking out loud, is that we're recommending they move forward. I mean, just acknowledge this. And I think everything about it seemed like once you get into the campus, it's more difficult to understand why anybody would really they're really the people that know what their needs are, whether it's housing or academic buildings and I certainly can appreciate what's going on there with Church Street because it's primarily lunch carts and pedestrians darting out there and not even sure cars that don't belong to the campus should even be on there.
Right.
It's dangerous. So students, when they're in their world, are not paying that much attention to crossing streets and stuff. So there's something to be said for that. And ending it in front of Mitchell or that parking garage with the cul-de-sac and turning it back around makes fine sense. I do think, listening to Bernie Flynn, he was saying at one time there was a check on the table for that street.
Mhm.
What happened to that? Be great to have that back.
I think they weren't allowed to sell public land. There was like a thing about it.
Well, yeah, there was something in that. But my point is if there's a benefit like that to the borough, we should, I'm just saying it.
Well, there is a benefit to having it open also, because we do make money on the parking there, so there's a, you
Sure.
know, I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't
the
know.
number-
I'm always hesitant to give up assets, whether they're, you know.
Sure, the number you threw out there was
Great.
pretty generous.
Yeah, yeah, I think all of that is good. I think if you all agree in the like broad scheme of things and have any red flags, I would just put that in a memo if you're comfortable with that, because again, it will come before you, but I think that would be helpful for council, let you guys know what you're looking at. So if that's something you're comfortable with, that's fine. You can also wait for the review letters.
I'm gonna wait for the review, but I think what we're gonna do in the meantime is if the four of us are here and whoever else might be, like Matt or Steve, if we can put our thoughts together, if there are specific concerns or things that you'd like to highlight, I think we pull it all together in one comprehensive letter that just kind of gives, you know, I don't think it's fair to get too much into the weeds on this.
No, I would just stay broad.
Sure.
That
Yeah.
would be great.
And I know, and like I said, there were other pieces in there, like the parking garages. They charge for those too, so I understand why they're a little bit lighter. If you're a student, you're driving somewhere else, I don't care if it's $1 for the day,
Mhm.
and finding the free lot down the street and parking.
Right.
I mean, I don't think when I was a student, I had any trouble walking. But anyway, so my point was,
I think that's different here. I don't think the students like to walk that.
yeah.
When I hear the feedback I get.
And then, does anybody have any comments on that?
So I just, there's another traffic study coming, is that what you're?
So,
Not
Sean asked RVE to respond to the consideration for closing, Church Street.
Right,
So he wanted them to talk about the traffic impact and like what
yeah,
that would look like.
yeah,
Yeah,
that's come screaming off the page.
yeah,
Sure,
yeah.
yeah.
Because it would drive whatever's through.
Oh,
Yeah.
easily, yeah.
At the same time, like I said, is the amount of actual traffic goes through the day is very, very light.
Daryl has a big problem with the buses turning around there, so he did.
When you say he had trouble having them turn around.
If they closed that street, where would the buses turn around?
Oh, well, the plan shows a turnaround or a cul-de-sac right in front of their new parking garage, which services the engineering. And then it's right, basically it's the depth of Mitchell Hall. So it's not going past the People's Building.
Right.
And then once you go south of that, it turns that into a pedestrian area, which to me, from a campus standpoint, I think makes sense. I think you got to understand what happens to University though, because that's dead ending, right? That would a dead end. So I'm not sure what happens there.
Yeah,
But that's the only two streets impacted, other than any potential drives out. But anybody that drives through there recognizes they've made an error by driving through there.
Right. Yeah.
So it's not faster for anybody.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So at Smart Growth, there was, I thought I heard a conversation about Westchester University does plan a presentation of this, maybe not to us, but can you
There-
provide any specifics on
I
it?
don't have any yet. I just know that they didn't want to do the hearing until they had public outreach and that they were supposed to schedule that sometime after the summer because everybody's out of school.
So the question I think is, would be great to hear them present it, hear a little before we put this together, but I'm a little confused about the deadlines. It
I
sounds
don't
like we,
think that you're gonna get that before they present to council, unfortunately. And
Okay.
yeah, and again, because it's so broad scope, I think
Yeah.
that's why. But things could change. I don't know. I'm like, Sean is really handling a lot of this, so I'm,
okay,
It's a lot. I know he was gonna have to work with West Goshen and stuff.
yeah, that was the other
A lot
thing
of
they're
time.
talking about.
Sure.
so I think the way to think about this is that we're really just addressing the conditional use portion of this thing. Every project that is, and they say this in their statement, every project they're gonna do, they're gonna come
Sure.
and we're gonna talk then
Sure.
zoning, area involved, all that
Right.
kind of stuff for each individual one.
Right.
So you don't need to be down to the granular level.
Mhm.
They do make references to some areas like east of High Street, which are really not in the PUC district, so they shouldn't be part of the plan. And you're dealing with the whole question, I think, of trying to understand the dynamics of how many students are they adding? How many beds are they adding? How
Yeah.
many parking spaces are they adding? And I think it's so much better than I had feared that I'm inclined to just sort of be positive about it. And I'm very positive about the way they've approached this in a very professional and comprehensive manner, I think. And I think we have, like, what is our responsibility? Our responsibility is very clear, to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people of Westchester, okay? That means Rosedale, means High Street, so that issue has got to be addressed. You know, I'm reminded of the tragic mistake when we didn't pay attention to this at the Justice Center, and let's not make that mistake again. And then I understand plans were sent to Comita, just like, are there other people we're expecting letters?
Just, no, it was just Tom Comita, and Panoni's not gonna
Okay.
review because there's no stormwater at this point or anything like that. Yeah, so it's really just Comita
We
and
don't
P.
need feedback from like county or?
I don't know if they are reaching out to them as well. I just, I know that Sean was talking to West Goshen about doing a joint conditional use hearing. I'm not sure
Okay,
if that'll happen, and I don't know what the county's feedback is. Yeah,
all right.
yeah. Sorry.
Alice? Anything? Alex? Nope. Okay, because I mean, like I said, it's for where it is, for what it is. The only
Yeah.
thing I would like, I agree with Alan, is it'd be great if somebody would come in and give us kind of a summary and an opportunity for our conversation.
Yes.
But certainly, I think, given the time constraint, I think if we can collect general thoughts and then
Yeah.
put them in and just say, hey, we do appreciate this submittal and we've reviewed it and there's, it looks like, we appreciate the fact that they've laid out a path forward and it seems to make all good sense, and as things come up specific, we can address. it.
Yeah.
But- All right, last line of business is, Jason Burrow is, stepping down from the planning commission. He's accepted a volunteer position with the Pennsylvania State Board of Architects, the licensure board. So I have to be on my good behavior now. So hopefully if somebody is looking for an opportunity to go to 9 o'clock at night, volunteering this time at a planning commission meeting, this is your opportunity. So feel free to reach out to Dana. And I would like to adjourn the meeting.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We'll take that for a second. All right, thank you. Do we have to text Bill?
I just texted him.